The text message came at 6:42 a.m., just as Dr. Cohen was explaining the risks of Ethan's spinal surgery. "Emergency at work. Can't make it. So sorry." That's what my husband of 10 years texted, not called, on the morning his son was being wheeled into an operating room. What Daniel didn't know was that by sunset, the luxury sedan he loved more than his family would be sold to a stranger. The locks on our home changed, and the truth about his work emergency spread across his entire company. I stared at my phone, my hand trembling slightly as I read his message again. 8-year-old Ethan looked up at me from his hospital bed, tubes already attached to his small arms, his favorite dinosaur plushie clutched against his chest. "Is Dad coming?" he asked, his voice small and frightened. I forced a smile and squeezed his hand. "He's trying his best, buddy," I lied, already knowing exactly where Daniel was. And it wasn't at work. Dr. Cohen gave me a sympathetic look, before continuing her explanation of the 7-hour procedure that would correct my son's severe scoliosis. A surgery we'd been preparing for, discussing, and dreading for months. A date that had been on our family calendar, mentioned at every dinner, and highlighted in red on every device we owned. There was no way Daniel had forgotten. No way this was a misunderstanding. As they wheeled Ethan toward the operating room, I kissed his forehead and promised I'd be waiting when he woke up. Unlike his father, I intended to keep that promise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first person I called after Ethan disappeared behind those swinging doors wasn't Daniel. It was Rachel, my best friend since college, who answered on the first ring despite the early hour. "He's not coming," I said, my voice surprisingly steady as I paced the sterile hospital corridor at Cascade Medical Center. "He's with her again." "That absolute piece of garbage," Rachel hissed. "Are you sure?" I was sure. For 3 months, I'd been tracking my husband's late nights at the office and weekend conferences. I'd seen the credit card charges at the Evergreen restaurant on evenings he claimed to be working. I'd found receipts for jewelry I never received. I'd even hired a private investigator who had documented Daniel's visits to Vanessa Pierce's downtown condo, including last night, when he should have been at home, helping our son prepare for the most significant medical procedure of his young life. "He promised Ethan he'd be here before surgery," I said, sinking into an uncomfortable waiting room chair, surrounded by other anxious parents. "He looked our son in the eyes and promised." Rachel's voice hardened. "What are you going to do?" For the first time that morning, I felt something other than hurt and disappointment. A cold clarity washed over me. Everything I should have done months ago. I ended the call and pulled out my laptop. As an elementary school teacher, I'd always been meticulously organized, a trait Daniel had once claimed to admire. This organization now served a different purpose, as I opened a folder labeled Exit Strategy. Inside were digitized copies of our financial records, property documents, insurance policies, and most importantly, bank statements showing Daniel's pattern of withdrawals and suspicious expenses. I'd been building this file gradually, ever since finding the first lipstick-stained collar 3 months ago. The surgery would take 7 hours. I had work to do. My first call was to James Montgomery, a divorce attorney Rachel had recommended. His secretary initially said he couldn't meet until next week, but when I calmly explained that my husband was missing our son's spinal surgery to be with his mistress, she miraculously found an opening that afternoon. Next, I called a locksmith and scheduled them to come to our Laurelhurst home at 2 p.m. Then I contacted Pacific Northwest Auto Gallery, where the owner still remembered selling Daniel his precious BMW 7 Series last year, a car he'd insisted was an investment, despite our mounting medical bills for Ethan's condition. "Mrs. Carter," the dealership owner said warmly, "what can I do for you today?" "I'm interested in selling my husband's car," I replied, my voice steady. "Today, if possible." There was a brief pause. Does Mr. Carter know about this? I smiled. Slightly, though no one could see it. Mr. Carter signed the car over to me last year for tax purposes. This was true. It had been his accountant's suggestion, one he'd followed without thinking twice. I have the title and all necessary paperwork. By 10 a.m., I'd arranged for the car to be evaluated at 3 p.m. By 10:30, I'd transferred half of our joint savings account to my new private account. Exactly half, not a penny more. At 11, I called Daniel's mother in Seattle. "Melissa, dear," she answered warmly. "How's Ethan doing? Is he out of surgery yet?" So Daniel hadn't even told his parents he was skipping the surgery. Interesting. "The surgery is going well," I said, omitting the fact that I wouldn't know anything for several more hours. "I'm calling because there's something you should know. Daniel isn't here. He chose to spend the night and morning with his mistress instead." The silence on the other end was deafening. Margaret Carter had always adored her son, often excusing his selfishness as ambition and his neglect as providing for his family. But even she had limits. "I see," she finally said, her voice tight. "And where is he now?" "That's an excellent question," I replied. "One you might want to ask him yourself." After hanging up, I checked my phone. No messages from Daniel, no calls, not even a text asking how his son's life-altering surgery was progressing. I looked at my watch. Almost noon. 5 hours since we'd arrived at the hospital. 4 since. Ethan had been wheeled away, terrified, but trying to be brave. At 12:30, I walked to the hospital cafeteria and forced myself to eat a sandwich. I would need my strength. As I was finishing my coffee, my phone finally buzzed with a message from Daniel. "In meetings all day, update me when he's out." I didn't respond. Instead, I called Gregory Phillips, Daniel's boss at Westridge Financial Group. Gregory had been to our home for dinner several times, had brought gifts when Ethan was first diagnosed, and had always spoken highly of Daniel's work ethic. "Gregory," I said when he answered, "it's Melissa Carter." "Melissa, how's Ethan doing? We're all thinking about him today." "That's actually why I'm calling," I said, keeping my voice level. "There seems to be some confusion. Daniel told me he couldn't be at the hospital today because of an emergency at work. Some kind of crisis meeting?" The pause told me everything I needed to know. "Melissa," Gregory said carefully, "there's no emergency here. In fact, Daniel called in a personal day today. He said he needed to be at the hospital with you and Ethan." "I see," I replied. "And yesterday afternoon, when he left early for what he called preparation meetings?" Another telling pause. "He said he needed to leave for a personal matter. Something about getting things ready for Ethan's recovery at home." "Melissa, is everything all right?" "No, Gregory, it isn't. But it will be. Thank you for being honest with me." At 1:30 p.m., I left the hospital briefly, having arranged for a nurse to call me immediately if there was any news about Ethan. I drove home, where the locksmith was already waiting. He changed every lock in the house while I packed Daniel's essential items into 2 suitcases. Not everything, just enough for him to manage temporarily. I wasn't cruel. I included his toiletries, medications, favorite clothes, and the watch his grandfather had given him. Everything else could be arranged later, through lawyers. By 2:45, I was at the car dealership, where they offered me a fair price for Daniel's beloved BMW. Not what he had paid for it, but enough. I signed the papers, transferred the title, and arranged for them to pick up the car from our driveway within the hour. The money would go directly toward Ethan's medical bills. At 3:30, I was back at the hospital, sitting in the waiting room, hands folded calmly in my lap. My phone buzzed constantly now. Daniel had discovered he couldn't access our joint savings account online. He would be furious, but I was beyond caring. Let him feel one fraction of the helplessness and betrayal I'd been feeling for months. At 4:15, Dr. Cohen finally emerged, still in her surgical scrubs, but with a smile on her face. "Ethan did beautifully," she said, sitting beside me. "His spine is now supported by 2 titanium rods and 16 screws. He'll need extensive physical therapy, but we expect a full recovery." Tears of relief spilled down my cheeks. "Can I see him?" "He's in recovery now. You can see him in about 30 minutes, but he'll be very groggy from the anesthesia." I thanked her, then stepped into the corridor to check my phone. 17 missed calls from Daniel, plus text messages ranging from confused to angry to threatening. The most recent read, "Where is my car? Why are my keys not working? Call me immediately." I took a deep breath and called him. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded when he answered. "I just got home and my key doesn't work, and my car is gone." "Lower your voice, Daniel," I said calmly. "Our son just spent 7 hours having his spine reconstructed without his father present. I told you there was an emergency at—" "Save it," I cut him off. "I spoke to Gregory. There was no emergency. There were no meetings. Just like there were no conferences in Seattle last month or client dinners that ran until 2 a.m. Just you and Vanessa Pierce." The silence on the other end was satisfying. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Your car has been sold," I continued. "The money is going toward Ethan's medical expenses, the ones you've been complaining about while spending thousands on your girlfriend. The locks have been changed because this is no longer your home. You chose Vanessa over your family today, so that's where you'll stay." "You can't do this," he sputtered. "That's my house too. My name is on the mortgage." "Yes, and we'll sort all that out legally. Your essential belongings are in 2 suitcases on the front porch. Everything else can be arranged through my lawyer. You've received his contact information by email." "This is insane." Daniel's voice rose again. "You've lost your mind. I'm coming to the hospital right now." "No, you're not," I said firmly. "Ethan is in recovery and seeing you would only upset him. I've instructed the nurses that only I am allowed in his room today. You can see him tomorrow, if he wants to see you." "He's my son." "Yes," I agreed. "He is. A fact you seem to have forgotten around 6 a.m. this morning when you chose your mistress over his surgery." "Goodbye, Daniel." I ended the call and turned off my phone. There would be time later for the anger, the grief, the complicated legal process that lay ahead. But right now, only one thing mattered: Ethan. When they finally let me into the recovery room, my little boy looked so small amid all the machines, his back immobilized, his face pale. But when his eyes fluttered open and found mine, he managed a weak smile. "Mom," he whispered. "Did I do good?" I took his hand gently, mindful of the IV. "You did amazing, my brave boy. I'm so proud of you." His eyes moved past me, searching the room. "Where's Dad?" The question I'd been dreading. I considered various lies, excuses to protect Daniel as I had so many times before. But looking at my son's face, I knew those days were over. "Dad couldn't be here today," I said gently. "But I need you to know that has nothing to do with you. Your dad loves you very much, but he's made some grown-up mistakes that he needs to fix." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded. Even at 8, he understood more than I gave him credit for. "Are you and Dad getting a divorce?" he asked quietly. I stroked his hair. "Yes, honey, I think we are. But that doesn't change how much we both love you. And it doesn't change the fact that you have the strongest, bravest spine in Portland now." That earned me a small smile before he drifted back to sleep, the anesthesia still heavy in his system. I turned my phone back on briefly to text Rachel. "Ethan's out of surgery. Everything went well. Can you bring my overnight bag to the hospital? I'm staying here tonight." Within an hour, Rachel arrived with my bag and a fierce hug. "I drove by your house," she whispered. Daniel was having a complete meltdown on the front lawn. 2 suitcases were open with clothes strewn everywhere. I felt nothing at this image. No satisfaction, no remorse, just emptiness where my marriage had once been. He called me, Rachel continued. Wanted me to talk some sense into you. I told him the only senseless thing was choosing his mistress over his son's surgery. Thank you, I said, meaning it, for everything. Rachel squeezed my hand. How are you really doing? I looked through the glass at Ethan, sleeping peacefully despite the trauma his body had endured. I'm free, I said simply. For the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe. That night, I slept in a recliner beside Ethan's hospital bed, waking whenever he stirred or the nurses came to check his vitals. By morning, my back ached and my eyes burned from lack of proper sleep, but I felt stronger than I had in months. At 9 a.m., James Montgomery, my lawyer, called with an update. Daniel's attorney reached out. He said, "They're pushing for reconciliation." "Not happening," I replied firmly. "I figured as much. Just so you know, selling the car was legally questionable, but since the title was in your name, there's not much he can do. The changed locks, however, he could potentially claim illegal eviction." "Let him," I said. "I'm sure a judge will be very sympathetic when they learn why he wasn't at his son's surgery." James chuckled. "You'd be surprised what judges have heard, but yes, it doesn't paint him in a favorable light. How's Ethan doing?" "Better than expected. They're talking about moving him to a regular room today." "Good. Focus on him for now. Let me handle Daniel and his lawyer." By afternoon, Ethan was alert enough to watch his favorite cartoons and eat some Jell-O. The medication kept his pain manageable, and the doctors were pleased with his progress. It was during this relatively peaceful moment that Daniel finally showed up, looking haggard in wrinkled clothes, his normally perfect hair uncombed. "Daddy!" Ethan's face lit up, and for a moment, I regretted the harshness of my actions. Whatever Daniel had done, Ethan still loved his father. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said, approaching the bed tentatively. He glanced at me, uncertain if I would order him out. I merely nodded and stepped into the hallway to give them some privacy. Through the window, I watched as Daniel held Ethan's hand, talking softly, occasionally wiping his own eyes. After 20 minutes, a nurse informed me that Ethan needed rest, so I re-entered the room. Daniel stood up immediately, his body tense. "Ethan needs to sleep now," I said, directing my words to our son. "Dad can come back later." Ethan nodded sleepily, the pain medication making him drowsy. Daniel hesitated, then leaned down to kiss Ethan's forehead. "I'll be back tomorrow, champ, I promise." This time, I followed Daniel into the hallway. "A promise from you doesn't mean much these days," I said quietly once we were out of Ethan's earshot. Daniel's shoulders slumped. "Melissa, what I did was unforgivable. I know that. But selling my car, changing the locks, you've turned my life upside down in one day." I stared at him in disbelief. "Your life! Your son had surgery on his spine. Yesterday, surgery you missed for what? Morning sex with your girlfriend? And you're upset about a car?" A passing nurse gave us a concerned look, and I lowered my voice. "You know what, Daniel? I'm done protecting your ego, your reputation, your precious career. Everyone knows. Your boss, your mother, our friends. Everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are now." His face paled. "You called my mother?" She deserved to know why her grandson's father wasn't at his surgery. Daniel ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I've messed up. I know that. Vanessa is... It's over. I ended it this morning. I want to come home, to fix things." "There's nothing to fix," I interrupted. "Our marriage was broken long before Vanessa. You've been lying for years about overtime, about business trips, about money. This was just the final straw. What about Ethan? He needs both his parents." "He does. I agreed. And he'll have both his parents, just not in the same house. The divorce papers will be ready next week. I'm asking for primary custody with generous visitation for you, provided you're actually there when you say you'll be. Daniel's eyes hardened. I'm not giving up that easily. The house can be sold and the proceeds split equitably, I finished for him. Or you can buy out my portion. I don't really care which. What I care about is up there in that bed, recovering from major surgery. I turned to go back to Ethan's room, but Daniel grabbed my arm. I made one terrible mistake. One? I laughed bitterly, pulling my arm away. You made hundreds of terrible mistakes, Daniel. Every lie, every night with her, every time you put yourself before your family. But missing Ethan's surgery? That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. And now you can live with the consequences of that choice. As I walked away, I heard him call after me. I still love you, you know. I didn't turn around. There was nothing left to say. Over the next 5 days, Ethan's recovery progressed remarkably well. Daniel visited daily, bringing gifts and spending hours reading to Ethan or helping him with the exercises the physical therapist prescribed. To his credit, he never missed a visit, never arrived late, and never mentioned our confrontation or the divorce in front of our son. On day 6, Ethan was discharged with a back brace and instructions for home care. Rachel helped me transform our living room into a temporary bedroom so Ethan wouldn't have to navigate the stairs to his room. Daniel came to help, working silently. Alongside us, the tension almost visible in the air. When Ethan was finally settled on the adjustable bed we'd rented, Daniel pulled me into the kitchen. The real estate agent called me, he said without preamble. You're really selling the house? I nodded. It makes the most sense. We can both start fresh. Where will you go? I've found a single-level house closer to my school. No stairs for Ethan to worry about during recovery. Daniel nodded slowly. I found an apartment downtown. I start moving in tomorrow. He hesitated. Melissa, I know it doesn't change anything, but I am truly sorry. Not just for Vanessa, but for everything. For taking you for granted, for not being the husband or father I should have been. For the first time, his apology seemed genuine, but it was too late. I believe you're sorry, Daniel, but you're right. It doesn't change anything. He nodded again, accepting this. Would it be all right if I stayed here tonight, on the couch? Just to be close if Ethan needs anything? It was a reasonable request, and despite everything, Daniel was still Ethan's father. The couch is fine, I agreed, but just for tonight. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, I sat on our patio with a glass of wine, staring at the stars. From inside, I could hear Daniel talking quietly on the phone. To his mother, it sounded like. Not to Vanessa. Not anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. How are you holding up? I considered her question carefully. How was I? Tired? Certainly. Stressed about the logistics of moving, of divorce, of Ethan's recovery. But beneath that was something unexpected. Peace. The constant knot of anxiety that had lived in my stomach for years, wondering where Daniel was, who he was, with what lie he would tell next, was gone. I'm good, I texted back. Really good. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, checking Ethan's backpack before school. His recovery had been remarkable. The titanium rods in his spine had done their job, and though he would always have impressive scars, he was already back to most normal activities. Mom! He called from the front door. Dad's here! Daniel's car, a modest sedan, not another luxury BMW, pulled into the driveway right on schedule. Our custody arrangement had settled into a predictable rhythm. Weekdays with me, weekends with Daniel, holiday rotations, and shared responsibility for medical appointments and school events. To my surprise, Daniel had followed through on every commitment, never missing a pickup or an appointment. The fury and threats from those first few weeks had gradually given way to a functional co-parenting relationship. Not friendship exactly, but something close to respect. As Ethan ran out to greet his father, I watched through the window. Daniel caught him in a careful hug, mindful of his back, then walked him around to see something in the trunk. Probably another gift. Daniel was still trying to buy forgiveness with presents, but he was also showing up consistently. That mattered more. My phone rang. James Montgomery, who had helped navigate the surprisingly civilized divorce. "Just checking in," he said when I answered. "The house sale is final. The proceeds have been split per the agreement, and the last of the paperwork is finished." "Thank you, James, for everything." "You did all the hard parts yourself," he reminded me. "Starting the day you changed those locks." After hanging up, I stepped onto the front porch. Daniel looked up from the car, where he was helping Ethan buckle his seatbelt. "We'll be back by 6, he called. "I'm taking him for pizza after the movie." I nodded. "Have fun. Text me if you'll be late." As they drove away, I didn't feel the familiar twist of anxiety in my stomach, the fear that Daniel would disappoint Ethan again, or that he was secretly meeting someone else. That concern had faded over months of consistent behavior. Back inside, I looked around my new home, smaller than our old house, but all mine. Peaceful, honest. The way I was teaching Ethan to be, by example rather than just words. Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most necessary outcomes. Sometimes you have to change the locks on your old life to open the door to a better one. I hadn't just sold Daniel's car that day. I'd sold the idea that I needed to accept less than I deserved. And in return, I'd bought something priceless. The knowledge that I was strong enough to stand alone, to protect my child, and to create a home built on truth rather than convenience. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't staying. Sometimes it's having the courage to leave. I stared at my reflection in the hospital bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back at me. 3 days of sleeping in a hospital chair had left dark circles under my eyes. But there was something else there too. A determination I hadn't felt in years. My phone buzzed on the counter with another text from Daniel, his 20th attempt to negotiate his way back home. I ignored it and splashed cold water on my face. When I returned to Ethan's room, Dr. Cohen was checking his incision site, her expression pleased with what she saw. "The surgical wounds are healing beautifully," she said, making notes on her tablet. "I'm going to recommend physical therapy 3 times a week once he's discharged." "When can I go home?" Ethan asked, his voice small but stronger than it had been yesterday. The surgery had been a success, but the recovery would be long and painful, something Daniel should have considered before prioritizing his affair over his son. "If things continue improving like this, possibly tomorrow afternoon," Dr. Cohen replied, giving his shoulder a gentle pat. "Your mom will need to set up your recovery space at home. Stairs are off limits for at least 3 weeks." I nodded, mentally rearranging our living room to accommodate a temporary bedroom. "I'll take care of everything," I assured her, already planning to call Rachel for help, moving furniture. After Dr. Cohen left, Ethan turned those big, questioning eyes toward me. "Has Dad called?" The question tightened something in my chest. Despite everything, Ethan still longed for his father's presence. "Yes, honey. He's planning to visit this afternoon." At least that's what Daniel had texted, among his many pleas and justifications. Whether he would actually show up remained to be seen. "Is he staying at Aunt Vanessa's house?" Ethan asked innocently, sending a jolt through me. "Aunt Vanessa?" I kept my voice carefully neutral. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Ethan shrugged, then winced as the movement pulled at his incision. "Dad said she's an old friend. We went to her apartment once when you were at your teacher conference. She made spaghetti. Ice spread through my veins. Daniel had taken our son to his mistress's apartment, introduced them, let this woman play house with my child. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd imagined possible. Ethan, when was this? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. I don't remember. A while ago. He yawned, the pain medication making him drowsy. She has a cat named Pepper. As Ethan drifted off to sleep, I stepped into the hallway and finally called Daniel back, anger simmering beneath my forced calm. Melissa. Thank God, he answered immediately. I've been trying to reach you. We need to talk about… You took our son to her apartment? I cut him off, keeping my voice low but intense. You introduced them? Made it seem normal? There was a pause, then a sigh. It wasn't like that. It was one time when you were out of town. I had a meeting canceled and… Stop lying, I interrupted. Ethan just told me about Aunt Vanessa and her cat and how she made him spaghetti. Like she's part of his life. Like what you were doing was okay. Melissa, no. Just no. I thought this was a recent thing, something impulsive and stupid. But you've been building a whole separate life, Daniel. One that included our son. But not me. Another pause, longer this time. I'm coming to the hospital now, he finally said. We should talk about this in person. Don't bother, I replied coldly. Ethan's sleeping, and I have nothing to say to you that can't be communicated. Through lawyers, I ended the call and leaned against the wall, trying to process this new information. Daniel's affair with Vanessa wasn't just physical. He'd been creating an alternate family structure, one where Ethan had another maternal figure. How long? Had he been planning to leave? Had he been waiting for the right moment, or for Vanessa to be ready to take on a stepmother role? My phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. Furniture all moved. Living room ready for Ethan. Need anything else? Rachel's unwavering support had been my lifeline through this ordeal. While Daniel had been building his secret life with Vanessa, I'd neglected my own friendships, too caught up in trying to save a marriage that had been failing for years. That would change now. Thank you, I texted back. Can you pick up his prescriptions? List is in my email. When I returned to Ethan's room, a nurse was adjusting his IV. He's doing remarkably well, she told me with a smile. Dr. Cohen is very pleased with his progress. He's always been strong, I said, watching my son's peaceful face as he slept. Stronger than I'd given him credit for. Children are resilient, I reminded myself. He would adapt to our new reality, just as I would. The afternoon stretched on, with Ethan drifting in and out of medicated sleep. I used the quiet time to contact my school principal about extending my leave of absence, research physical therapists specializing in pediatric spinal recovery, and finally, to call a real estate agent about listing our house. Are you sure about selling? The agent asked after I explained my situation. The market is good right now, but have you considered alternatives? I'm sure, I replied firmly. Too many memories. We both need a fresh start. By 4 o'clock, there was still no sign of Daniel, despite his insistence that he was coming to the hospital. Another broken promise to add to the growing list. I wasn't surprised, just disappointed for Ethan's sake. At 4:30, the door finally opened, but it wasn't Daniel. It was an elegant woman in her 60s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a designer handbag. Margaret Carter, my mother-in-law. Melissa, she said quietly, her eyes immediately going to Ethan's sleeping form. How is he? Better than expected, I answered, genuinely pleased to see her despite the circumstances. Margaret had always been kind to me, even if she sometimes enabled Daniel's worst tendencies. The surgery was successful. She nodded, setting her bag down and taking the chair opposite mine. Daniel called me, she said without preamble. He told me everything, about the woman, about missing the surgery, about what you did in response. I tensed, preparing for her to defend her son as she usually did. Instead, she reached across the bed and took my hand. "I raised him better than this," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "His father and I taught him about responsibility, about family. I don't know where we went wrong." The unexpected support brought tears to my eyes. "You didn't go wrong, Margaret. Daniel made his choices." "Bad ones," she agreed with surprising frankness. "Selling his car was perhaps a bit dramatic, but after what he did." She shook her head. "I told him he's lucky you didn't set it on fire." A startled laugh escaped me, drawing a small smile from my mother-in-law. "Where is he now?" I asked. Margaret's expression hardened slightly. "Supposedly on his way, though he claimed that hours ago. I suspect he's with her, trying to salvage whatever is left of that relationship now that you've exposed it." "You think he's still seeing her, even after all this?" She sighed heavily. "Daniel has never been good at being alone. It's one of his greatest flaws. When his father was sick, instead of facing it, Daniel buried himself in work. When you were struggling with Ethan's diagnosis, he distanced himself. He runs from difficult emotions." It was the most insightful critique I'd ever heard Margaret make of her son. "I thought it was just me," I admitted. "That I wasn't enough to keep his interest." "No, dear," Margaret patted my hand. "This is a pattern that began long before you. I just never confronted it as directly as you have." She glanced at Ethan. "Though I never imagined he would abandon his own child during surgery." We sat in companionable silence for a while, watching Ethan sleep. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "What can I do to help? With Ethan's recovery?" "Actually," I said, "I could use help setting up his recovery space at home. Rachel, my friend, has moved furniture, but there's still equipment to arrange, prescriptions to pick up." "Consider it done," Margaret said firmly. "I'll coordinate with your friend and make sure everything is ready when they discharge him. And Melissa," she hesitated, "whatever happens between you and Daniel, Ethan is still my grandson. I hope I can remain part of his life." "Of course," I assured her, surprised she would even question it. "You're his grandmother. That doesn't change." Relief softened her features. "Thank you. Now, why don't you take a break? Get some fresh air, maybe something to eat that isn't from the cafeteria. I'll stay with Ethan." The offer was tempting. I hadn't left the hospital since Ethan's surgery, except for the brief trip home to change the locks. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. Take an hour for yourself. Doctor's orders," she added with a wink. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a cafe across from the hospital, a real cup of coffee and a sandwich in front of me, when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Carter?" a woman's voice asked when I answered. "This is Vanessa." Pierce. My blood ran cold. The audacity of this woman to call me, today of all days. "How did you get this number?" I demanded. "From Daniel's phone," she admitted. "I know this is inappropriate, but I need to speak with you." "We have nothing to discuss," I said icily, preparing to hang up. "Please," she insisted. "It's about Ethan." That stopped me. "What about Ethan?" "I need to tell you something, and I'd rather do it in person. I'm in the hospital parking lot." I should have hung up, should have blocked her number and continued with my sandwich. But curiosity, or perhaps a perverse desire to finally see the woman who had helped destroy my marriage, won out. "Fine. I'm at the cafe across the street. Red awning. You have 10 minutes." I watched through the window as a tall woman with sleek dark hair crossed the street. She was younger than me, as I'd expected, but not dramatically so. Professional looking, in a tailored blazer and jeans. Pretty, but not the bombshell I'd imagined during my darkest moments. She spotted me through the window and entered the cafe, her expression a mixture of determination and discomfort. "Mrs. Carter," she said, standing awkwardly by my table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "It's Ms. Bennett now," I corrected her, reverting to my maiden name, even though the divorce wasn't yet final. "And I said you have 10 minutes. The clock is ticking." She sat down, placing her purse carefully on the chair beside her. "I wanted to tell you that I've ended things with Daniel," she began. "After learning he missed Ethan's surgery to be with me, I couldn't continue the relationship." "Congratulations on finding your moral compass," I said sarcastically. "Is that all?" "No." She took a deep breath. "There's something else you should know. Daniel told me he was separated when we met. He said you were filing for divorce, that you were only living together for Ethan's sake until after his surgery." I stared at her, processing this new lie of Daniel's. "And you believed him?" "I did," she acknowledged. "Until yesterday, when he showed up at my apartment saying his crazy wife had changed the locks and sold his car. That's when I realized he'd been lying to me too." For the first time, I felt a flicker of sympathy for this woman. Daniel had manipulated us both. "He told me you were essentially roommates," she continued, "that you slept in separate bedrooms, that you had an understanding." "There was no understanding," I said flatly. "There was just lying and betrayal." Vanessa nodded, her composure cracking slightly. "I know that now. And I'm sorry. I never would have." She paused. "I have a nephew Ethan's age. I would never knowingly be part of hurting a child. When Daniel brought Ethan to my apartment, he said it was an innocent visit with his father's friend. I didn't realize he was using my home to normalize our relationship for when he eventually left you." The pieces were falling into place. Daniel hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been methodically preparing to leave, setting up a replacement family, introducing Ethan to Vanessa in a friendly context so the transition would be smoother. "Did you know about his condition?" I asked. "About the surgery?" "I knew Ethan had scoliosis," she admitted. "Daniel mentioned it, but he downplayed the seriousness. He never told me about the surgery date until yesterday, when he admitted where he'd been supposed to be." She looked down at her hands. "That's when I ended it." I studied her, trying to decide if she was telling the truth. Her discomfort seemed genuine, as did her regret. "Why are you telling me all this?" I finally asked. "Because you deserve to know the truth, and because I'm leaving Portland. I've accepted a position in Chicago, a decision I made yesterday after realizing the extent of Daniel's deception." I nodded slowly. "I appreciate your honesty, even if it's rather late in coming." "There's one more thing," she said, reaching into her purse. She withdrew a small velvet box and placed it on the table between us. "He bought this. I found it in his jacket pocket last week when I was hanging it up. He doesn't know I saw it." With a sense of dread, I opened the box. Inside was a diamond engagement ring, large, ostentatious, and definitely expensive. Daniel had been planning to propose to his mistress while still married to me. "He told me your divorce would be final next month," Vanessa explained quietly. Another lie, obviously. I closed the box and slid it back toward her, nauseated by the sight of it. "Keep it. Sell it. Whatever. I don't want anything to do with it." "Neither do I," she said, pushing it back. "But I thought you might use it as evidence in your divorce proceedings, or sell it to help with Ethan's medical expenses." She had a point. The ring looked expensive enough to cover several months of Ethan's physical therapy. "Fine," I relented, taking the box and dropping it into my purse. "Is there anything else?" Vanessa hesitated. "Just take care of Ethan. He's a wonderful boy. He deserves better than what Daniel and I put him through." With that, she stood up, nodded awkwardly, and left the cafe. I watched her walk away, this woman who had unknowingly become entangled in Daniel's web of lies, just as I had been for years. The only difference was that she had managed to break free sooner. I finished my coffee and headed back to the hospital, my mind racing with this new information. Daniel hadn't just been cheating, he'd been planning an entirely new life, complete with a replacement wife. The thought made my stomach twist with a mix of anger and, surprisingly, relief. This confirmed that ending our marriage was the right decision. When I returned to Ethan's room, Margaret was reading him a story. He brightened when he saw me. "Mom, Grandma brought me a new dinosaur book." "That's wonderful, sweetie," I said, kissing his forehead. "How are you feeling?" "Better. The nurse said, maybe I can try walking tomorrow." Margaret closed the book and stood up. "He ate some applesauce while you were gone. Dr. Cohen stopped by and said his vitals are excellent." "Thank you for staying with him," I said sincerely. She nodded, gathering her purse. "I'll head to your house now and help your friend prepare for Ethan's homecoming. Call me if you need anything else." After she left, Ethan looked at me with those perceptive eyes that missed so little. "Is Grandma mad at Dad?" I sat carefully on the edge of his bed. "Why do you ask that?" She kept making her mad face when she talked about him, and she said he was disappointing in her quiet voice. "Well," I said carefully, "Grandma is upset that your dad missed your surgery. We all are." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Is that why you sold his car, because you're mad?" I stared at him, surprised. "How did you know about that?" "I heard Grandma talking on the phone. She said you sold Dad's car and he was really mad about it." I sighed, wondering how to explain my actions to an 8-year-old. "Sometimes, honey, when grown-ups make really bad choices, there are consequences. Dad made a very bad choice when he missed your surgery. Selling his car was a consequence." Ethan considered this. "Like when I don't do my homework and you take away my video games." "Something like that," I agreed, grateful for his simple analogy. "But much more serious." "Is Dad in timeout?" he asked, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. Despite everything, I laughed. "Yes, I suppose he is in timeout. A very long one." Ethan seemed satisfied with this explanation and returned to his dinosaur book. I marveled at his resilience, his ability to process complicated adult situations through the lens of his 8-year-old understanding. Children adapt, I reminded myself again, often better than adults do. The evening passed quietly. Daniel never showed up, despite his promise to visit. I wasn't surprised, but Ethan's repeated glances at the door broke my heart. At 8 p.m., I helped him take his medication and settle in for the night, the hospital room dimly lit by the monitoring equipment. "Mom?" he asked sleepily as the pain medication began to take effect. "Is Dad going to live with us when we go home?" I stroked his hair gently. "No, honey. Dad will have his own place, and you'll stay with him sometimes when you're feeling better. But mostly you'll be with me in our new house." "New house?" His eyes widened slightly despite his drowsiness. "Yes, we're going to move to a nice 1-story house closer to your school. No stairs to worry about while your back heals." He yawned. "Will I still have a dinosaur room?" "Absolutely. Even better than your current one." This seemed to satisfy him, and he drifted off to sleep. I settled into the recliner beside his bed, my own exhaustion finally catching up with me. Just as I was about to doze off, my phone vibrated with a text from Daniel. "I'm sorry I couldn't make it today. Emergency at work. We'll try again tomorrow." Another lie. After my conversation with Vanessa, I had no doubt where he'd really been. Trying to salvage what he could of that relationship, or perhaps drowning his sorrows over both his girlfriend and his car. "Ethan asked about you all day," I replied, not bothering to hide my disappointment. "Don't make promises you won't keep." I turned off my phone and closed my eyes, exhaustion pulling me under despite the uncomfortable chair. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, discharge planning, medication management, the ongoing divorce proceedings. But tonight, I allowed myself to simply rest beside my son, grateful for his healing and for my own growing strength. Morning arrived with the soft sound of rain against the hospital windows. Portland's perpetual drizzle matched my mood as I stretched in the recliner, my back protesting after another night of uncomfortable sleep. Ethan was already awake, attempting to reach the cup of water on his bedside table. "Let me help you," I said, quickly moving to his side. "I can do it," he insisted, his determined expression so like his father's it made my heart ache. "The nurse said I need to start doing things myself." I backed off, allowing him the independence he craved while staying close enough to intervene, if needed. "You're right, but remember to move slowly and not twist your spine." He managed to grasp the cup and take a small sip, his face lighting up with accomplishment. "See? I did it." "You certainly did," I agreed, pride swelling in my chest. "You're getting stronger already." A knock at the door interrupted our moment. To my surprise, Daniel stood in the doorway, freshly shaven and holding a large stuffed dinosaur and a bouquet of balloons. "Dad!" Ethan's face brightened instantly. "Hey, champ!" Daniel said, entering cautiously as if unsure of his welcome. He glanced at me. "Melissa, good morning." I nodded stiffly, stepping back to give him space with Ethan, but not hiding my displeasure at his broken promise yesterday. "Look what I brought you," Daniel said, presenting the enormous plush triceratops to Ethan. "And these are for you too." He handed him the balloons, which featured various dinosaurs and get-well-soon messages. "Cool," Ethan exclaimed, examining his gifts with delight. "Can we tie them to my bed?" While Daniel secured the balloons to the bed rail, I stepped into the hallway to give them some privacy and to collect myself. Seeing Daniel acting like father of the year after everything that had happened made my blood boil. But I wouldn't let Ethan see my anger. He deserved whatever happiness he could find in this situation. Dr. Cohen approached as I was taking deep breaths in the corridor. "Good morning, Melissa. How's our patient today?" "Improving," I reported. "He's more alert and managed to reach for his water independently this morning." "Excellent," she said, reviewing notes on her tablet. "If his pain levels remain manageable and he can demonstrate basic mobility, I think we can discharge him this afternoon as planned." "That's wonderful news," I said sincerely. "I've arranged everything at home for his recovery." Dr. Cohen lowered her voice slightly. "I see Mr. Carter is here today. Will he be involved in Ethan's home care?" The question caught me off guard. "We're separating," I admitted. "But yes, he'll be involved in Ethan's care on a scheduled basis." She nodded professionally. "I understand. I'll make sure both of you receive the home care instructions and physical therapy regimen." After she left to check on other patients, I composed myself and returned to Ethan's room. Daniel was sitting beside the bed, listening intently as Ethan explained something about dinosaur migration patterns from his new book. "Dr. Cohen says you might be able to go home today," I told Ethan, whose face lit up at the news. "Really? Awesome." "That's great, buddy," Daniel said, then turned to me. "What can I do to help with the discharge process?" His offer seemed genuine, but after yesterday's no-show and the revelations from Vanessa, I wasn't in a charitable mood. "Your mother and Rachel have already handled the home preparations," I said coolly. "But you can pick up his prescriptions if you'd like to. Be useful." If Daniel was offended by my tone, he didn't show it. "Of course, just give me the list." I handed him the prescription orders Dr. Cohen had prepared, along with the address of our preferred pharmacy. "They should be ready by noon." "I'll take care of it," he promised, then hesitated. "Melissa, could we talk privately for a moment?" Part of me wanted to refuse, to tell him we had nothing to discuss outside of Ethan's care and the divorce proceedings. But the rational part knew we needed to establish some ground rules for co-parenting during Ethan's recovery. 5 minutes, I agreed. Ethan will be right outside the door. Once in the hallway, Daniel's confident facade crumbled slightly. I want to apologize for not coming yesterday. I know I promised, but… Save it, I interrupted. I'm not interested in your excuses, and I'm certainly not interested in whatever lie you've concocted about where you were. He flinched at my directness. I deserve that. But I'm here now, and I want to help with Ethan's recovery however I can. Where were you yesterday? I asked bluntly, crossing my arms. Daniel looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I was dealing with some things. With Vanessa? I pressed, watching his reaction closely. His head snapped up, surprise evident in his expression. How did you… She came to see me yesterday, I informed him. A grim satisfaction in watching his face pale told me everything. About how you claimed we were separated, about how you were planning to propose. Melissa, I can explain. No need. I cut him off. She already did. Very thoroughly. Including how she's moving to Chicago to get away from you. Daniel leaned against the wall, looking deflated. I've made a complete mess of everything. For once, we agreed on something. Yes, you have, but right now, I don't care about your personal crisis. All I care about is Ethan's recovery. So here's how this is going to work. I laid out my expectations clearly. Daniel would have scheduled visiting times at the house while Ethan was recovering, but he would not stay overnight. He would take Ethan to physical therapy appointments on his designated days. He would not bring up our marital problems in front of Ethan. And most importantly, he would never, ever make a promise to Ethan that he couldn't keep. Are we clear? I concluded. Daniel nodded, a mixture of shame and relief on his face. Crystal clear. And Melissa, I am sorry for everything. I'm not the one who needs your apology, I replied, nodding toward Ethan's room. He is. Now go get his prescriptions, while I finish the discharge paperwork. As Daniel walked away, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. For years, I had been the accommodating one, making excuses for his absences, smoothing over his mistakes, prioritizing his career over my own needs. But that version of me was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who demanded respect rather than hoped for it. By 3 p.m., the discharge process was complete. Ethan, dressed in loose-fitting clothes that wouldn't irritate his incision, sat in a wheelchair as required by hospital policy, clutching his new dinosaur and looking both excited and apprehensive about going home. Daniel had returned with the prescriptions and insisted on driving us home, an offer I accepted primarily because it saved me from having to arrange transportation. The car ride was quiet, with Ethan occasionally pointing out things through the window and Daniel responding with forced enthusiasm. The awkwardness between us was palpable, but Ethan seemed oblivious, too focused on the novelty of going outside after days in the hospital. When we arrived home, Rachel and Margaret were waiting on the porch. They had transformed the living room into a comfortable recovery space complete with an adjustable bed, a small refrigerator stocked with Ethan's favorite drinks, and his gaming system connected to the television within easy reach. "This is awesome!" Ethan exclaimed, as Daniel carefully helped him from the car to the wheelchair we'd rented for the first phase of his recovery. "Welcome home, sweetheart," Margaret said, bending to kiss his cheek. "We've got everything ready for your recovery headquarters." Inside, I was touched by the thoughtfulness of their preparations. Rachel had arranged Ethan's dinosaur collection on shelves within his view, and Margaret had prepared several meals that were now stored in the freezer, labeled with heating instructions. "Thank you both," I said sincerely. "This is incredible." Rachel squeezed my hand. "That's what friends are for. And future ex-mothers-in-law, apparently," she added with a smile toward Margaret, who chuckled in agreement. Daniel stood awkwardly in the entryway, taking in the domestic scene with an expression that mingled regret and exclusion. "Where should I put Ethan's medication?" "On the kitchen counter," I directed. "I've set up a schedule for his pain management and antibiotics." While Daniel organized the prescriptions, I helped Ethan get settled in his new bed. The physical therapist had shown us how to position pillows to support his back properly, and Ethan was already mastering the controls that allowed him to adjust the bed's angle. "This is like having a spaceship command center," he declared, pressing buttons to demonstrate the bed's features. "Just remember what Dr. Cohen said about not sitting up too straight yet," I reminded him gently. "Your back needs time to heal." Margaret approached with a tray of light snacks and juice. I thought our patient might be hungry after the excitement of coming home. Ethan accepted the offerings eagerly, and for a moment the scene almost felt normal. A family caring for a sick child, working together to ensure his comfort and recovery. But the illusion shattered when Daniel cleared his throat. "I should probably get going," he said, his discomfort evident. "Unless there's anything else you need help with?" The question hung in the air, and I could feel Rachel and Margaret watching me, waiting to see how I would respond. "Actually," I said, surprising myself, "if you could help move Ethan's gaming system a bit closer to his bed, that would be helpful. The cords don't quite reach comfortably." It was a small task, but Daniel jumped at the opportunity to be useful. While he rearranged the electronics, I stepped into the kitchen with Rachel and Margaret. "Are you okay with him being here?" Rachel asked quietly. "We can run interference if you need us to." I shook my head. "It's fine. For Ethan's sake, we need to establish some kind of working relationship." I lowered my voice further. "Besides, I met with his mistress yesterday." She told me everything. Both women's eyes widened. "You did what?" Rachel exclaimed, then immediately lowered her voice. "What happened?" "I'll tell you later," I promised. But the short version is that Daniel has been lying to everyone, including her. She's ending things and moving to Chicago. Margaret sighed heavily. "That boy always thought he could have everything without consequences. I'm glad at least one of his houses of cards is collapsing." When we returned to the living room, Daniel had successfully adjusted the gaming setup and was showing Ethan how to access his saved games without having to move. "Thank you," I acknowledged, genuinely appreciative of his effort. "Ethan needs to rest now. His next pain medication is due in an hour." Daniel nodded, understanding the dismissal. He bent to kiss Ethan's forehead. "I'll be back tomorrow, champ. Get some rest, okay?" "Okay, Dad," Ethan replied sleepily, the day's excitement catching up with him. I walked Daniel to the door, maintaining a professional distance. "The physical therapist will be here at 10 tomorrow morning if you want to observe the first session." "I'll be here," he promised, then hesitated. "Melissa, about what Vanessa told you." "Not now," I cut him off. "Not with Ethan awake and my support system here. We'll discuss it another time." He nodded, accepting my boundary for once. "Fair enough. Thank you for letting me be part of today." After he left, I returned to find Ethan drifting off to sleep, his new dinosaur tucked beside him. Margaret was tidying up the kitchen, and Rachel was organizing Ethan's medication into a pill organizer. "That went better than expected," Rachel commented as I collapsed onto the sofa. "He's on his best behavior," I replied. "The question is, how long it will last?" Margaret joined us, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I've known my son his entire life, and I've never seen him quite so chastened. You've accomplished what his father and I never could. You've made him face consequences." I thought about Daniel's expression when I mentioned Vanessa, the shock and dismay that his carefully constructed deceptions had been exposed. "Let's see if it sticks," I said, unconvinced. "He's lost his girlfriend, his car, and his house in 1 week. Reality is hitting him hard right now. And his wife," Rachel added. "Don't forget he's losing you too." I smiled wryly. "I think he lost interest in me long before this week." Margaret surprised me by sitting down and taking my hand. "No, Melissa. Whatever his failures as a husband, and they are numerous, I don't believe Daniel ever stopped caring for you. He just lost his way. Badly." Her words stirred uncomfortable emotions I wasn't ready to examine. Either way, it's too late. Now. She nodded, not pushing further. Well, we've made enough food to last several days. The physical therapist knows the schedule. And I've arranged for a cleaning service to come twice a week while Ethan is recovering. So you don't have to worry about housework. I was touched by her thoughtfulness. Margaret, that's incredibly generous. It's the least I can do, she replied. Now, Rachel and I should go and let you both rest, but I'm only a phone call away if you need anything at all. After they left, the house fell quiet except for Ethan's soft breathing. I checked that his medication was organized, that water was within his reach, and that the baby monitor we'd repurposed was working so I could hear him from my bedroom if he called out during the night. Then, finally alone, I allowed myself to process the events of the past few days. I'd sold my husband's car, changed the locks on our home, initiated divorce proceedings, and confronted his mistress, all while supporting my son through major surgery. The weight of these actions should have felt crushing, but instead, I felt lighter than I had in years. For so long, I had compromised myself to maintain a marriage that existed more in appearance than in substance. I had accepted Daniel's half-truths and outright lies, had made excuses for his absences, had shouldered the burden of raising Ethan largely alone while preserving the fiction of our perfect family. Now that fiction was gone, replaced by a harder but more honest reality. And in that reality, I was discovering a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The courage to demand better, not just for Ethan, but for myself as well. As I prepared for bed, I realized the house no longer felt empty without Daniel. Morning light filtered through the curtains as I measured Ethan's medication into the small plastic cup. 2 weeks had passed since his surgery, and we'd settled into a new routine. Physical therapy 3 times a week, homeschooling in between, and careful monitoring of his pain levels and mobility progress. The constant rhythm of recovery left little time to dwell on my crumbling marriage, which was perhaps a blessing. "Mom?" Ethan called from his makeshift bedroom in the living room. "Can I try walking to the bathroom by myself today?" I carried his medicine to him, pride swelling at his determination. "Let's see what Dr. Cohen says at your appointment this afternoon. We don't want to rush things." He accepted the pills with a grimace. He hated swallowing them, but didn't argue. In the past 2 weeks, my energetic 8-year-old had matured in ways I hadn't expected, displaying a patience that sometimes exceeded my own. Dad texted. He informed me, holding up the tablet we'd given him for entertainment during his recovery. "He's picking us up for the appointment at 2. I nodded, maintaining a neutral expression. Daniel had been surprisingly consistent since Ethan's discharge, showing up exactly when promised, and following the physical therapist's instructions to the letter. Whether this newfound reliability would last remained to be seen, but for now, I was cautiously grateful. "I'll make sure you're ready by 1:30 then," I said, helping him adjust his position in the bed. "Would you like some breakfast?" While Ethan ate, I checked my email, finding a message from James Montgomery, my divorce attorney. The asset evaluation was complete, and we were ready to proceed with formal negotiations. The house had been appraised at significantly more than we'd paid for it 5 years ago, a small victory in a situation filled with losses. Another email caught my attention, a response to my application for a teaching position at Westside Elementary, just a few blocks from the single-level home I'd put a deposit on last week. The principal wanted to schedule an interview. Things were falling into place, each step taking me further from the life I'd shared with Daniel and closer to the independent future I was building. The doorbell rang at precisely 1:30. Daniel had been using the doorbell rather than his key, or attempting his key in the new locks, a small acknowledgement of the boundaries I'd established. I opened the door to find him looking more put together than he had in weeks. The designer stubble he'd cultivated during his early midlife crisis was gone, replaced by a clean shave. His casual clothes had been exchanged for a button-down shirt and slacks. His attempt at respectable divorced dad, I assumed. "Hi," he said, holding up a paper bag. "I brought Ethan's favorite sandwich from Parkway Deli. Thought he might be hungry after the appointment." "That was thoughtful," I acknowledged, stepping aside to let him in. "He's ready to go, just waiting. For you." Daniel's face brightened at the sight of Ethan, who was already dressed in loose-fitting clothes that wouldn't irritate his surgical scars. "Hey, buddy, ready for your checkup?" "Yep," Ethan replied with determination. "I'm going to ask Dr. Cohen if I can start walking more. I'm tired of being stuck in bed." "One step at a time, champ," Daniel cautioned, the irony of his sudden parental responsibility not lost on me. "Let's get you to the car. I brought pillows to make the ride comfortable." I watched as Daniel carefully helped Ethan into the wheelchair we used for longer distances. His movements were gentle, attentive, everything he should have been all along. Where was this version of Daniel when Ethan was first diagnosed? When we were making the agonizing decision about surgery? When our son was being wheeled into the operating room? The thought threatened to reignite my anger, but I pushed it down. Today wasn't about Daniel or me. It was about Ethan's recovery. "I'll grab his medication chart," I said, retrieving the detailed log I'd been keeping of Ethan's pain levels and medication timing. Dr. Cohen had praised its thoroughness at our last appointment. In the car, Daniel's modest sedan that had replaced his beloved BMW. Ethan chatted excitedly about the new video game his grandmother had brought him yesterday. Daniel listened attentively, asking questions and seeming genuinely interested. I sat in the back beside Ethan, ensuring his position was comfortable for the 15-minute drive to Cascade Medical Center. At the hospital, Dr. Cohen greeted us with her usual efficient warmth. "Ethan Carter, my star patient. Let's see how that spine of yours is doing." The examination was thorough but gentle. Dr. Cohen checked Ethan's incision sites, now healing into neat pink lines, and tested his reflexes and mobility. Daniel and I watched anxiously as she asked Ethan to perform various movements, noting his range of motion and any signs of discomfort. "Impressive progress," she declared finally, making notes in his chart. "The surgical sites are healing beautifully, and your mobility is better than I expected at this stage." "So, can I walk more?" Ethan asked eagerly. Dr. Cohen smiled. "Yes, but with supervision. Short distances at first, and always with someone nearby in case you need support. No stairs yet, and absolutely no lifting, bending, or twisting." Ethan pumped his fist in victory, while Daniel and I exchanged relieved glances. It was the first genuinely positive update we'd received since the surgery. "What about school?" I asked. Ethan had been doing assignments at home, but I knew he missed his friends and routine. "Another 2 weeks of home recovery," Dr. Cohen advised. "Then we can discuss part-time return to classroom settings, provided he continues progressing well. He'll need accommodations, no physical education, a second set of textbooks to keep at home to avoid carrying weight, and permission to get up and move around during long classes to prevent stiffness." I nodded, mentally adding these requirements to the list I was compiling for Ethan's school. Daniel, to my surprise, was taking detailed notes on his phone. "I'll contact the school administrator," he volunteered. "My schedule is more flexible than yours right now, and I can meet with them to discuss accommodations." It was a practical offer, and one that would genuinely help. "Thank you," I said, meaning it. That would be helpful. After the appointment, Daniel drove us back home, Ethan excitedly planning his first supervised walk around the living room. The atmosphere between Daniel and me remained cordial but distant. Co-parents focused on our child's well-being rather than our own complicated emotions. "Would you like to stay for a while?" I found myself asking as Daniel helped Ethan back into the house. "You could supervise his first official walk if you'd like." Daniel's surprise at the invitation was evident, but he quickly nodded. "I'd like that very much." Inside, Ethan insisted on trying immediately, eager to test his new freedom. "Just to the kitchen and back," I cautioned, hovering nearby as he carefully shifted to the edge of the bed. Daniel positioned himself on Ethan's other side, ready to provide support if needed. "Take it slow, buddy. No rush." With determined concentration, Ethan stood up, wincing slightly as he straightened. The back brace provided necessary support, but movement was still uncomfortable. He took one tentative step, then another, his face a mixture of discomfort and triumph. "Look, I'm doing it," he exclaimed, shuffling slowly toward the kitchen. "You're doing great," Daniel encouraged. "Just a few more steps." I watched them together, father and son connected by this small but significant moment, and felt an unexpected tightness in my throat. This was how it should have been all along. Both of us present for the important milestones, supporting Ethan, together despite our differences. When Ethan successfully completed his journey to the kitchen counter and back, we both applauded, genuine pride overwhelming any lingering tension between us. "Can I do it again?" Ethan asked eagerly. "Let's wait until this evening," I suggested. "Your body needs to adjust gradually. Small victories, remember?" After getting Ethan settled with his tablet and a celebratory cookie, Daniel and I retreated to the kitchen, the awkwardness returning now that our shared focus on Ethan had momentarily lifted. "He's doing really well," Daniel commented, leaning against the counter. "Better than I expected, honestly." "He's always been resilient," I replied. "Gets that from my side of the family." Daniel's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Clearly. Especially considering recent events." I tensed, unsure if this was leading to an argument about the car or the locks, or any of the other justified reactions to his betrayal. "I'm not criticizing," he added quickly, noticing my expression. "Just acknowledging that resilience seems to run in the Bennett genes." The use of my maiden name, which I'd reverted to informally, though not yet legally, was unexpected. "Thank you," I said cautiously. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Listen, Melissa, I've been wanting to talk to you about everything." "Not to change your mind about the divorce," he clarified, seeing my expression harden. "That ship has sailed, and I understand why. But I owe you an explanation, or at least an honest conversation." Part of me wanted to refuse, to tell him I wasn't interested in his excuses or justifications. But another part, the part that had shared 10 years of marriage and would be co-parenting with this man for at least the next decade, recognized the potential value in closure. "All right," I agreed. "But not now. Not with Ethan in the next room. And not here." "Dinner?" he suggested. "Tomorrow night?" My mother already offered to stay with Ethan. Of course she had. Margaret had been remarkably supportive of me throughout this ordeal, but she was still Daniel's mother. She probably hoped this dinner would lead to reconciliation. "Fine," I said. "But just to be clear, this is a conversation, not a date. Nothing is changing my mind about the divorce." "Understood," Daniel agreed readily. "Just conversation. I'll make a reservation at McMenamin's. Neutral territory, not too fancy, and private enough to talk." After confirming the details, Daniel spent another hour with Ethan, helping him with a science assignment before saying goodbye. His extended presence in what was now firmly my space felt strange. Not entirely uncomfortable, but definitely unfamiliar, like finding an old sweater that no longer quite fits. Once he was gone, I called Rachel to tell her about the dinner plan. As expected, her reaction was skeptical. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" she asked. "He's obviously trying to worm his way back in. 2 weeks of decent behavior doesn't erase what he did." "I'm not taking him back," I assured her, "but we'll be co-parenting for years. If having one civilized conversation provides some closure and makes that easier, it's worth it." Rachel wasn't convinced. Just don't let him manipulate you. He's been lying to you for months, probably years. This sudden transformation into Father of the Year is suspicious. Trust me, I said. I'm going in with my eyes wide open. That night, after Ethan was asleep, I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me had changed, not just physically, though the stress of recent weeks had left its marks, but fundamentally. There was a certainty in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a quiet confidence born from making difficult decisions and surviving their aftermath. The following evening, Margaret arrived early to stay with Ethan, bringing several new books and games to keep him entertained. "You look lovely," she commented, noting the simple dress and light makeup I'd chosen for the dinner. "Not that you're trying to impress anyone, of course." I raised an eyebrow at her transparent hope. Just aiming for put-together adult having a civilized conversation rather than frazzled mom in yoga pants. She laughed, patting my arm. "Of course, dear. Take your time tonight. Ethan and I have plenty to keep us busy." McMenamin's was busy but not crowded when I arrived exactly on time. Daniel was already seated at a corner table, looking uncharacteristically nervous. He stood as I approached, awkwardly pulling out my chair. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." "I said I would," I replied simply. "I've always kept my promises." The subtle jab wasn't lost on him. "I deserved that," he acknowledged, "and many more like it." A server appeared to take our drink orders. White wine for me, just water for Daniel, which surprised me. He'd always enjoyed a good scotch with dinner. "I'm trying to be more clear-headed these days," he explained, noticing my reaction. "Make better decisions." Once our drinks arrived and we'd ordered food, the pretense of casual dinner conversation evaporated. Daniel took a deep breath, clearly, having rehearsed what he wanted to say. "First, I want to be absolutely clear that I know there's no chance of reconciliation," he began. "I've accepted that our marriage is over, and that it ended because of my choices, my terrible, selfish choices." I nodded but didn't interrupt. Let him say whatever he needed to say. "The affair with Vanessa was inexcusable," he continued. "But it was a symptom, not the cause. I've been lost for a long time, Melissa. Probably since Ethan's diagnosis." This caught my attention. Ethan had been diagnosed with severe scoliosis 2 years earlier, after a routine school physical education screening. "I didn't know how to handle it," Daniel admitted. "The specialists, the treatments, the possibility of surgery, it terrified me. Not the medical bills or the logistics, but the emotional weight of it. Our perfect little boy was suffering, and I couldn't fix it." "So you checked out instead," I said, the pieces finally fitting together. Daniel's increasing absences, his late nights at work, his emotional distance, all had escalated after Ethan's diagnosis. "Yes," he agreed, shame evident in his voice. "I buried myself in work, told myself I was providing financially while you handled the medical stuff. But really, I was just hiding. And then I met Vanessa." "At the hospital fundraiser," I finished, for him. The night he'd given that speech about family values and medical ethics. The irony was almost too perfect. Daniel nodded. "She was new in town, didn't know anyone, didn't know about Ethan's condition. Being with her was an escape. I could pretend to be someone else, someone without those worries and responsibilities." "So you created a whole separate life," I said, thinking of Vanessa's revelation about the engagement ring. "Complete with plans for the future." He had the decency to look ashamed. "I got caught up in the fantasy of it. The idea that I could start over, do better the second time around. It was delusional, obviously." "And taking Ethan to her apartment? Making him part of this fantasy?" The anger I'd been controlling bubbled to the surface. That crossed a line, Daniel. I know, he said quietly. That was unforgivable. I told myself I was just introducing them casually in case things progressed, but I was manipulating everyone, including our son. The server arrived, with our food, interrupting the tense conversation. I picked at my pasta, appetite diminished by the direction of our discussion. None of this explains or excuses missing Ethan's surgery, I said once we were alone again. That was the final straw for me. Not the affair, not the lies, though those were certainly enough, but choosing to be with her instead of supporting your son through the most frightening day of his life. Daniel set down his fork, his food equally untouched. There's no explanation. That makes that okay, he agreed. I could tell you I panicked, that I couldn't face the possibility of something going wrong during the surgery. I could tell you I convinced myself you had it handled, that Ethan wouldn't really miss me. But those are just excuses for my cowardice. His frankness was unexpected. I had prepared for denials, for minimizing, for blame shifting. The usual tactics Daniel employed when confronted with his failures. This straightforward acknowledgement of wrongdoing was new territory. So why tell me all this now? I asked. What's the point if you recognize that reconciliation isn't possible? Daniel seemed to choose his next words carefully. Because I want us to be able to co-parent effectively. Because I want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. Selling the car, changing the locks, filing for divorce. You were protecting yourself and Ethan from more hurt, and you were right to do so. He took a sip of water before continuing. And because I want to do better, not to win you back, but because Ethan deserves a father who shows up, who keeps his promises, who puts his child's needs ahead of his own selfish desires. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity. Finding none, I asked the question that had been bothering me since his sudden transformation. Why should I believe this change is real or permanent? 2 weeks of good behavior doesn't erase years of selfishness. You shouldn't believe it, he said simply. Words mean nothing at this point. Only consistent actions over time will prove whether I'm actually capable of change. All I'm asking is for the chance to try, not for your forgiveness, but for Ethan's sake. His answer was surprisingly reasonable. No grand promises, no dramatic declarations, just a humble request for the opportunity to be a better father. I can accept that, I said after a moment, but understand this. I'll be watching. One missed visit, one broken promise to Ethan, and your access becomes strictly supervised. I won't let him be hurt by your inconsistency again. Daniel nodded, solemnly. That's fair. More than fair, actually. We finished our meals in relative silence, the weight of the conversation settling between us. As we waited for the check, Daniel hesitantly broached another subject. I've been seeing someone, he said. Not a therapist, I immediately assumed, but another woman. My stomach tightened at the thought that he'd moved on so quickly after Vanessa, but he continued. A therapist, I mean. Since the day after you changed the locks, twice a week. This revelation genuinely surprised me. Daniel had always dismissed therapy as paying someone to tell you what you already know. It's helping, he added, making me confront patterns I've been repeating my whole life. The running away when things get hard, the seeking validation outside our marriage, the emotional immaturity. He shook his head. I'm learning that my behavior wasn't about you or even about Vanessa. It was about my own inability to deal with difficult emotions. I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me, a small, wounded part, wanted to say it was too little, too late. But the more rational side recognized that Daniel's self-improvement, even if it came too late for our marriage, would benefit Ethan in the long run. I'm glad you're getting help, I said finally. That's a positive step. After Daniel paid the bill, I didn't protest. It was the least he could do. We walked to our separate cars in the parking lot. The evening air was cool but not unpleasant, carrying the scent of impending rain. "Thank you for listening," Daniel said as we reached my car. "I know you didn't have to." "We'll always be connected through Ethan," I replied. "Better to establish some kind of peace between us." He nodded, maintaining a respectful distance. "For what it's worth, Melissa, you were never the problem in our marriage. You were always the one holding everything together while I was falling apart. I just couldn't see it then." The admission touched something in me. Not a desire to reconcile, but perhaps the first glimmer of the closure I had been seeking. "Goodbye, Daniel," I said, unlocking my car. "I'll see you at Ethan's physical therapy session on Friday." "I'll be there," he promised. And for the first time in a long while, I actually believed him. Driving home, I reflected on our conversation. Daniel's explanation didn't excuse his behavior, but it did provide context I had been missing. His inability to cope with Ethan's medical challenges, his pattern of emotional avoidance. These weren't justifications, but pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for years. Why had my attentive husband gradually transformed into a distant stranger? Why had our once solid marriage eroded so dramatically? Now, at least, I understood the internal mechanisms that had driven his destructive choices. Understanding didn't mean forgiveness, at least not yet. But it did offer something almost as valuable: perspective. My decision to end our marriage wasn't just a reaction to Daniel's affair or his absence during Ethan's surgery. It was the necessary response to years of emotional neglect and dishonesty. Even if Daniel truly changed, even if therapy transformed him into the man he should have been all along, that wouldn't erase the damage already done. When I arrived home, Margaret was reading to Ethan, who looked drowsy but content. "How was dinner?" she asked, her expression carefully neutral. "Surprisingly productive," I replied truthfully. We had an honest conversation. Hope flickered in her eyes, but I shook my head slightly, letting her know reconciliation wasn't on the table. To her credit, she accepted this with grace. Well, that's progress at least. Ethan had a wonderful evening. He practiced walking to the bathroom twice, all by himself. After Margaret left, I helped Ethan prepare for bed, adjusting his pillows for optimal comfort and giving him his evening medication. "Did you and Dad have a good dinner?" he asked sleepily. "We did," I said, stroking his hair. "We talked about how we're going to make things work with you living in 2 different houses once you're better." Ethan considered this. "Will you guys ever get back together?" The question wasn't unexpected, but it still pierced my heart. "No, sweetie. Dad and I care about you very much, but we won't be married anymore. Sometimes adults realize they're better parents when they live separately." He nodded thoughtfully. "Like Tyler's parents. They live in different houses, but they both come to his soccer games." "Exactly like that," I confirmed, grateful for his ability to find relatable examples. "Dad and I will both be at all your important events. We'll just be cheering from different seats." This seemed to satisfy him, and he drifted off to sleep soon after. I stood watching him for a moment, this brave little boy who was handling major surgery and his parents' divorce with remarkable resilience. Children adapt, I reminded myself again. With love and stability from both parents, Ethan would be okay. The following weeks brought a new rhythm to our lives. Ethan grew stronger daily, progressing from short, supervised walks to moving independently around the house. Daniel remained consistently present, taking Ethan to physical therapy as scheduled and helping with homeschool assignments during his visits. Our interactions were cordial, focused on Ethan's needs rather than our own complicated history. 3 weeks after our dinner conversation, I received an email from the principal at Westside Elementary, offering me the teaching position. The same day, my real estate agent called with news that my offer on the single-level house had been accepted. Pieces were falling into place, creating the framework for our new life. That evening, I shared the news with Ethan. We'll be moving. In about a month, I explained, showing him pictures of the new house on my tablet. There's a park just down the street, and your new school is close enough that we can walk there once you're fully recovered. Ethan scrolled through the photos with interest. Does it have a backyard? A small one, I confirmed. And you'll have your own bedroom, of course. We can decorate it however you'd like. With dinosaurs? He asked, eyes brightening. Absolutely. Dinosaurs from floor to ceiling if that's what you want. His expression grew more serious. What about Dad? Where will he live? Dad has found an apartment downtown, I explained. You'll stay with him some weekends and during school breaks. He's setting up a great room for you there too. Ethan considered this new arrangement. So I'll have 3 bedrooms? Here at the new house? And at Dad's? Well, we'll be selling this house, I clarified. But yes, you'll have your room at the new house and at Dad's apartment. He nodded, processing this information with surprising maturity. Can I help pack my stuff? Of course. The doctor says you should be able to do more activity by then, as long as you don't lift anything heavy. Later that night, I called Daniel to update him on the house and job situation. As the custodial parent, I wasn't legally required to consult him about the move, especially since it was within the same city and school district. But our recent truce had made me more inclined toward transparency in matters concerning Ethan. That's great news about the job, Daniel said sincerely. Westside has an excellent reputation. Thanks, I replied. The house is just a few blocks from the school, which will make mornings easier once Ethan's back to regular classes. There was a brief pause before Daniel asked, would it be all right if I came to see the new place once you're settled? Just so I can picture where Ethan will be living when he's not with me. The request was reasonable, even thoughtful. Of course, I agreed. Actually, if you're free this weekend, you could take Ethan to see it. The current owners said we could visit any time. It might help him get excited about the move. I'd like that, Daniel said, audible relief in his voice at my willingness to include him in this transition. Thank you. As I hung up, I realized something had shifted between us. The raw anger I'd felt upon discovering his betrayal had evolved into something more manageable. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of detached acceptance. Daniel had been a terrible husband, but he was making genuine efforts to be a better father. For Ethan's sake, I could acknowledge that effort without reopening my own wounds. The weekend visit to the new house went better than expected. Daniel brought Ethan in his wheelchair, though our son insisted on walking through parts of the house to get a better feel for the space. Together, they measured his future bedroom and discussed furniture placement, dinosaur-themed decor, and the optimal setup for his gaming system. I watched them from the doorway, struck by the strange new dynamic between us. In some ways, Daniel was more engaged as a co-parent than he had been as a husband. Without the pressures and expectations of marriage, he seemed more present, more attuned to Ethan's needs and interests. This is a great house, he said as we prepared to leave. Good bones, nice neighborhood, perfect layout for Ethan's recovery. It feels right, I agreed. A fresh start for both of us. Daniel nodded, understanding that both referred to Ethan and me, not him. The school is walking distance? 3 blocks, I confirmed. And there's a good physical therapy center nearby that takes our insurance. You've thought of everything, he said, a note of something like admiration in his voice. You always do. The compliment was unexpected but not unwelcome. For years, my planning and organization had been taken for granted, my attention to detail dismissed as fussiness rather than appreciated as necessary care. This acknowledgement, small as it was, felt validating. On the drive back to our current house, Ethan fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the excursion. Daniel lowered his voice to avoid waking him. The divorce papers are ready for my signature. he said quietly. James sent them to my lawyer yesterday. I'd been wondering when this would come up. The legal process had been moving forward in the background while we focused on Ethan's recovery. Yes, he mentioned they would be finalized soon. I'm not contesting anything, Daniel assured me. The division of assets you proposed is more than fair. More than I deserve, honestly. His easy acceptance surprised me. I had expected at least some negotiation over the house proceeds or retirement accounts. Thank you for making this part straightforward, at least. Daniel was quiet for a moment before speaking again. Can I ask you something? And you can tell me it's none of my business. I tensed slightly, wary of personal questions that might veer into uncomfortable territory. You can ask. Are you okay? Not just with the divorce or with Ethan's recovery, but generally, after everything I put you through. The question caught me off guard with its genuine concern. When was the last time Daniel had inquired about my well-being in such a direct way? I'm getting there, I answered truthfully. Some days are harder than others, but overall, yes, I think I'm okay. He nodded, seeming relieved. Good. You deserve to be okay. Better than okay, actually. We finished the drive in silence, but it wasn't the tense, resentful silence that had characterized our interactions before Ethan's surgery. This was something different, a quiet acknowledgement that we were finding our way toward a new relationship, not as husband and wife, but as co-parents committed to our son's well-being. When we arrived home, Daniel carefully carried the still sleeping Ethan inside and placed him on his bed in the living room. I should go, he whispered. Let him rest, but I can come back tomorrow to help with his exercises if you'd like. That would be helpful, I said. His physical therapist wants him to increase his repetitions this week. Daniel nodded and moved toward the door. Melissa, he said, pausing with his hand on the doorknob. Thank you. For what? For not keeping Ethan from me when you had every right to. For allowing me to be part of his recovery despite what I did. He searched for the right words. For handling this whole terrible situation with grace I haven't earned. I considered his words, recognizing the truth in them. I could have made this much harder. Could have fought for sole custody. Could have poisoned Ethan against his father. Could have used Daniel's affair as leverage to take everything in the divorce. But that vindictiveness wasn't in me, and more importantly, it wouldn't have served Ethan's best interests. I'm not doing it for you, I said finally. I'm doing it for Ethan. He needs both his parents, even if one of them has made serious mistakes. Daniel nodded, accepting this explanation without protest. Nevertheless, thank you. After he left, I sat beside Ethan's bed, watching his peaceful sleep. 6 weeks ago, my world had been shattered by Daniel's betrayal and Ethan's surgery. I had reacted with an uncharacteristic boldness, selling the car, changing the locks, demanding respect I had long been denied. Those actions had been born of hurt and anger, a defensive response to protect what remained of my dignity. But now, something different was emerging from the wreckage of my marriage. Not just the independent life I was building, but a new understanding of my own strength. The woman who had changed those locks wasn't just reacting to betrayal. She was reclaiming her power, establishing boundaries that should have existed all along. As I stroked Ethan's hair, I realized that selling Daniel's car hadn't just been an act of revenge. It had been the first step toward rebuilding my life on my own terms. A life where I made the decisions, where my worth wasn't defined by someone else's attention or approval. A life where I modeled for my son what healthy self-respect looked like. Whatever came next, the move, the new job, the finalized divorce, I would face it with the same clarity and determination that had guided me through these past weeks. Not just for Ethan's sake, but for my own. The moving truck arrived at 7 in the morning, temporarily blocking our quiet suburban street as burly men in company shirts began unloading our belongings into the new house. Ethan watched excitedly from the porch swing, his back brace now smaller and more flexible as his recovery progressed. 8 weeks post-surgery, he was walking independently and had returned to school part-time, though physical education and certain activities remained off-limits. "Can I show them where my dinosaur stuff goes?" he asked, his face bright with anticipation. After weeks of preparation and anticipation, moving day had finally arrived. "Let them get the furniture in first," I suggested, checking items off my meticulously organized list as they were carried inside. "Then you can direct dinosaur placement." Our new home was everything I'd hoped for. A modest 3-bedroom ranch with an open floor plan, no stairs for Ethan to navigate, and a small backyard where he could eventually play once his spine fully healed. The previous owners had maintained it beautifully, meaning we could move in without any renovations or major repairs. One less stress in a season filled with changes. Rachel arrived carrying coffee and pastries, her contribution to the moving day effort. "The place looks even better than the photos," she observed, handing me a much-needed caffeine boost. "Very Melissa. Practical, but charming." "Thanks for coming to help," I said gratefully, especially since it's Saturday. "Are you kidding? I wouldn't miss move-in day. This house represents your independence declaration." She lowered her voice, glancing at Ethan, who was now enthusiastically directing movers about the placement of his bed. "How's he handling everything?" "Better than expected," I replied, watching my son with pride. "The new school has been wonderfully accommodating, and he's excited about having special rooms at both houses." The term had been Ethan's invention, his way of reframing the reality of divided living arrangements into something positive. His room at Daniel's downtown apartment was the city special room, while his bedroom here was the neighborhood special room. His therapist had praised the coping mechanism as healthy and adaptive. "And how about you?" Rachel pressed. "Ready? For your first official day as a single homeowner?" The question gave me pause. There had been so many practical details to manage: closing costs, insurance transfers, utility setups, that I hadn't fully processed the emotional significance of this step. "I think I am," I said finally. "It feels right, like I'm finally living authentically." Rachel squeezed my arm affectionately. "From watching your husband drive away with his mistress on surgery day to homeowner and newly employed in just 2 months, if that's not a glow-up, I don't know what is." I smiled at her characteristic bluntness. Rachel had been my steadfast supporter throughout this transition, never softening her criticism of Daniel even as our co-parenting relationship improved. Her loyalty was comforting, even if her perspective sometimes lacked nuance. "Speaking of Daniel," I said, checking my watch, "he should be here soon to help with Ethan's room setup." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Still playing the attentive father? Color me surprised that it's lasted this long." 8 weeks and counting, I confirmed. "No missed visits, no broken promises. He's actually been reliable." "Wonders never cease," Rachel muttered, but without her usual venom. Even she had to acknowledge Daniel's consistent presence in Ethan's life since the surgery. By mid-morning, most of the furniture had been placed, and boxes labeled with each room's designation were stacked in appropriate areas. Ethan was supervising the arrangement of his dinosaur collection on the built-in shelves in his new bedroom when Daniel arrived, carrying a housewarming plant and what looked suspiciously like more dinosaur paraphernalia. "Sorry I'm late," he said, setting down his offerings. Traffic was backed up on Burnside. "You're right on time," I assured him. "We're just starting to unpack Ethan's room." Daniel knelt carefully beside Ethan, mindful of his still healing back. "What do you think of your new special room, buddy?" "It's awesome," Ethan declared, Mom says I can paint one wall with a dinosaur mural if I want. That sounds incredible, Daniel agreed, then turned to me. Need an extra pair of hands for anything specific? I gestured toward the stack of boxes. If you could help unpack those while I sort out the kitchen, that would be great. Rachel's handling the living room. Daniel nodded, rolling up his sleeves and getting to work without complaint. It was still strange seeing him in this role. Helpful, accommodating, without the subtle resentment that had characterized so much of our marriage. Therapy was apparently having an impact, though whether it would last remained to be seen. The day progressed in a flurry of unpacking, arranging, and occasional debates about furniture placement. By late afternoon, the house was taking shape, transforming from an empty shell into our new home. Ethan's room was nearly complete, his dinosaur collection displayed prominently and his clothes neatly arranged in the closet. The kitchen was functional, if not fully organized, and the living room furniture had been arranged to create a cozy, welcoming space. Rachel left around 4, citing a dinner date as her excuse, but clearly giving us space to navigate this new family dynamic without an audience. Daniel stayed, continuing to help with the unpacking while respecting the boundaries I had established. He didn't venture into my bedroom or offer unsolicited opinions about my decorating choices. His focus remained on Ethan and the common areas they would share during visitation. As evening approached, Daniel ordered pizza, remembering everyone's preferences without being prompted, a small detail that didn't go unnoticed. We ate in the barely furnished dining room, using paper plates and sitting on mismatched chairs, while Ethan chattered excitedly about which posters should go where in his new room. "I have physical therapy on Tuesday, right, Dad?" Ethan asked. "Between bites of pepperoni pizza." "That's right," Daniel confirmed. "I'll pick you up from school and take you, then bring you back here afterward. We're working on strengthening those back muscles." The casual way he referenced their routine, a routine he had maintained faithfully since Ethan's discharge from the hospital, stood in stark contrast to his pre-surgery unreliability. The man who had missed his son's operation for his mistress now organized his entire schedule around Ethan's recovery needs. After dinner, Ethan's energy finally began to wane, the excitement of moving day catching up with him. "I think it's time for you to try out that new bed," I suggested, noting his drooping eyelids. "But we're not finished unpacking," he protested weakly, even as he yawned. "The boxes will still be here tomorrow," Daniel assured him. "Rest is part of your recovery plan, remember?" While I helped Ethan with his evening medication and bedtime routine, Daniel quietly cleared the dinner debris and broke down the empty boxes that had accumulated throughout the day. When I emerged from Ethan's room, I found him sealing the last of the cardboard into neat bundles. "He fell asleep almost immediately," I reported. "I think all the excitement wore him out." Daniel nodded, tying the final bundle of cardboard. "Not surprising. It's been a big day for all of you." He hesitated, then added, "The house looks great, Melissa. It suits you." "Thank you," I said, accepting the compliment at face value. "It's smaller than our old place, but it feels more manageable." "More yours," Daniel suggested, accurately identifying what I hadn't articulated. "Without the baggage of our history." I nodded, surprised by his insight. Exactly. A fresh start. An awkward silence fell between us, the kind that often developed when we weren't discussing Ethan or practical matters. Without our son as a buffer, the weight of our failed marriage and impending divorce hung in the air, an invisible but palpable presence. "I should probably get going," Daniel said finally, reaching for his jacket. "Let you settle in properly." "Thank you for your help today," I said sincerely. "It made a big difference having another set of hands." He nodded, moving toward the jar. "The divorce papers are officially filed," he mentioned, his tone carefully neutral. "My lawyer says we should have the final decree within a month." The information wasn't unexpected. I'd been copied on the email exchanges, but hearing it spoken aloud made it more real somehow. Soon, our decade-long marriage would exist only in memory and legal history, our connection limited to Ethan and the co-parenting relationship we were cautiously constructing. "That's good," I said, matching his neutral tone. "Closure is important." Daniel paused at the door, his expression unreadable. "Melissa, I know I've said this before, but I am truly sorry for everything. Not just the affair or missing the surgery, but for all the ways I failed you over the years. You deserved better." The apology seemed genuine, free from the manipulation or self-pity that might have colored it weeks earlier. Still, I maintained emotional distance, unwilling to revisit. "Old wounds. Thank you for saying that. I hope you'll remember that feeling when Ethan needs you in the future." He nodded, accepting the redirection to our son. "I'll pick him up on Monday after school for our dinner, unless his back is bothering him." "He's been feeling good this week," I confirmed. "Monday should be fine." With a final nod, Daniel left, closing the door gently behind him. I locked it, a simple action that now carried deeper significance. This was my door, my locks, my house. The locks hadn't been changed to keep someone out. They were new because everything here was new. Mine. I wandered through the partially unpacked rooms, taking inventory of what remained to be done tomorrow. Despite the chaos of boxes and misplaced items, the house already felt like home in a way our larger, more elegant previous residence never had. Perhaps because I had chosen it myself, for myself and Ethan, without compromising to accommodate someone else's preferences or priorities. In the kitchen, I uncovered the coffee maker and set it up for morning, a small act of domesticity that established normalcy amid the transition. As I worked, I noticed Daniel had unpacked and arranged the spice rack exactly how I'd always organized it in our old house, alphabetical, with baking spices on the top shelf and cooking spices below. A small detail he had apparently noticed despite years of seeming indifference to such things. I pushed the observation aside, unwilling to assign too much meaning to what was likely just efficient unpacking. Daniel's improved behavior was commendable, particularly as it related to Ethan, but it didn't erase the past or change our future. We were co-parents now, not partners. His attention to detail came years too late. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the disorienting moment of not immediately recognizing my surroundings. Then reality clicked into place. New house, new beginning, new life. I stretched in the barely made bed, surrounded by boxes still waiting to be unpacked, and felt a sense of peace that had been elusive for months, perhaps years. Patting quietly to check on Ethan, I found him still asleep, his dinosaur comforter pulled up to his chin. His room was the most complete in the house, our priority during yesterday's unpacking frenzy. Seeing him settled so comfortably eased any lingering doubts about the move. In the kitchen, I started the preset coffee and began listing mental priorities for the day. Finish unpacking essential items, arrange Ethan's school supplies for his return to part-time classes tomorrow, call the internet company about the sluggish connection, make time for Ethan's gentle exercise routine. A soft knock at the door interrupted my planning. Through the sidelight window, I spotted Margaret's silver hair and immediately moved to answer. "Good morning," she greeted me cheerfully, holding up a basket of muffins and fruit. "I thought you might appreciate breakfast that doesn't require finding the right box." "You're an angel," I said gratefully, accepting the basket and stepping aside to let her in. "Coffee's ready if you'd like some." Margaret entered, her eyes taking in the half-unpacked space with appreciation rather than judgment. "The house looks lovely, Melissa. So bright and welcoming." "We've still got a way to go," I admitted, gesturing toward the stacks of boxes. "But it's coming together." "Daniel mentioned you could use an extra pair of hands today," she said, removing her light jacket. "I thought I'd offer mine, if they'd be welcome." The offer was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Despite the awkwardness of maintaining a relationship with my soon-to-be ex-mother-in-law, Margaret had proven herself to be firmly in Team Ethan throughout this ordeal, never taking sides or making excuses for her son's behavior. "That would be wonderful," I said sincerely, "especially if you can help with the kitchen. You always had a knack for organization." Margaret beamed at the compliment. "The kitchen is my specialty. Point me to the right boxes and I'll have it functional by lunchtime." We worked companionably through the morning, Margaret efficiently arranging the kitchen while I tackled the linen closet and bathroom essentials. When Ethan woke, he was delighted to find his grandmother already installed in our new home, especially when she produced chocolate chip muffins from her breakfast basket. "How's the new bed, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, watching fondly as he devoured his second muffin. "Super comfortable," Ethan reported enthusiastically. "And I can see the backyard from my window. Mom says we might get a bird feeder." "What a wonderful idea," Margaret agreed. "I have one at my house that attracts the most beautiful chickadees." As they chatted about backyard birds, I was struck by how seamlessly Margaret had adapted to our new family configuration. Unlike many parents who might have taken their child's side in a divorce, she had maintained her relationship with me independently of her bond with Daniel. Her presence today was evidence of that continued connection. Around noon, Daniel called to check on Ethan's adjustment to the new house. I put the phone on speaker, so Ethan could share his excitement directly. "Dad, Grandma's here and she brought muffins, and we're setting up my bookshelf with all my dinosaur books in size order." Daniel's laugh came through the speaker, warm and genuine. "That sounds awesome, buddy. Are you being a good helper with the unpacking?" "Uh-huh. I organized all my clothes in the closet and made my bed all by myself." "Impressive. How's your back feeling today? Any soreness?" Their conversation continued, natural and affectionate, while I returned to unpacking, giving them space for this father-son moment. Daniel's consistent concern for Ethan's physical comfort, his genuine interest in the details of Ethan's day, these were the behaviors of the attentive father I had always hoped he would be. The irony that they emerged only after our marriage ended wasn't lost on me. After Ethan handed the phone back, Daniel asked to speak with me privately. "The physical therapist called," he said once I took the phone off speaker. "She wants to increase Ethan's sessions to 3 times a week for the next month. Says his progress warrants more intensive strengthening now." "Did she mention insurance coverage?" I asked, immediately calculating the potential financial impact. "Already handled," Daniel assured me. "I called the insurance company and they've approved the additional sessions. No extra cost to you." The "to you" caught my attention, a subtle acknowledgement that our finances were now separate, our joint responsibility transformed into parallel obligations. "Thank you for taking care of that," I said, genuinely appreciative of his initiative. "Of course," he replied, as if handling such matters had always been his strong suit, when in reality it represented a significant change from his previous detachment from Ethan's medical care. "Also, I found his favorite hoodie in my car. I'll bring it when I pick him up tomorrow." After we hung up, I returned to find Margaret arranging my collection of cookbooks on a kitchen shelf. "Daniel seems very engaged with Ethan's care," she observed carefully, testing the waters. "He's been surprisingly consistent," I acknowledged, helping her adjust the heaviest books. "Since the surgery, he hasn't missed a single appointment or visitation." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "His therapist is helping him recognize his patterns of avoidance. It's changing him, I think. Not enough to save your marriage, of course," she added quickly, "but perhaps enough to make him a better father." The direct acknowledgement that our marriage was beyond saving, coming from Daniel's own mother, was strangely validating. Margaret harbored no illusions about reconciliation, no fantasies that Daniel's recent improvements might lead me to reconsider the divorce. "I hope so," I said simply, "for Ethan's sake." The rest of the weekend passed in a blur of unpacking, organizing, and settling in. By Sunday evening, the house was largely functional, though certain areas, like my home office, remained works in progress. Ethan had fully embraced his new environment, proudly showing Rachel and another visiting friend every feature of his neighborhood special room and the backyard where he envisioned future play structures once his back healed completely. Monday morning brought our first real test of the new routine. Ethan would attend school for half a day, then Daniel would pick him up for their regular Monday dinner before bringing him home to the new house. So many transitions, so many opportunities for confusion or miscommunication. "Remember, Dad's picking you up at noon," I reminded Ethan as I helped him put on his backpack, carefully adjusted to minimize strain on his healing spine. "And he'll bring you here, to the new house, afterward." "I know, Mom," Ethan said with the slight exasperation of a child who feels over-instructed. "Dad already texted me a picture of our new address and said his car's GPS is all set up." I smiled at this evidence of Daniel's preparation. Of course, he had already programmed the new address and confirmed the pickup details. This new, attentive version of my soon-to-be ex-husband continued to surprise me. After walking Ethan to school, a pleasant 10-minute stroll that would become our daily routine, I returned home to continue unpacking and prepare for my own new beginning. In 1 week, I would start my position at Westside Elementary, teaching 3rd grade just 3 blocks from our new house. The proximity would allow me to remain accessible for Ethan's needs while reclaiming my professional identity. The morning passed quickly as I organized my teaching materials and responded to emails from my new principal. At precisely 12:15, my phone chimed with a text from Daniel. "Picked up Ethan. He had a great morning at school. We're headed to lunch, then we'll be at your place around 5:30. The simple courtesy of the update, letting me know our son was safely with him and confirming their schedule, represented another small but significant change in our co-parenting dynamic. Before, Daniel might have altered plans without notice or forgotten to communicate basic logistics, leaving me to wonder and worry. With Ethan safely accounted for, I turned my attention to the remaining boxes in my bedroom. Tucked at the bottom of one, I found a small velvet pouch I had almost forgotten. The engagement ring Daniel had purchased for Vanessa, which she had given to me during our coffee shop confrontation. I had placed it in my jewelry box, intending to sell it to help with Ethan's medical expenses, but in the chaos of the move, it had slipped my mind. I opened the pouch, examining the ring with detached curiosity. It was large and flashy, with a center diamond surrounded by smaller stones. Nothing like the simple solitaire Daniel had given me a decade earlier. The style seemed designed to impress, to make a statement about wealth and status rather than intimate connection. It revealed something about how Daniel had viewed his relationship with Vanessa, as a fresh start, yes, but also as a performance, a second chance to project success and affluence. The discovery left me feeling oddly peaceful, rather than hurt. This tangible evidence of Daniel's planned future with another woman no longer triggered pain or jealousy. Instead, it reinforced the rightness of our separation, the necessity of the path I had chosen when I changed those locks and demanded respect. I returned the ring to its pouch and placed it in my desk drawer. Tomorrow, I would research reputable jewelers to assess its value. The proceeds would go directly into Ethan's medical fund, transforming this symbol of betrayal into something constructive and healing. At 5:25, Daniel's car pulled into the driveway. I watched through the window as he helped Ethan carefully exit the vehicle, maintaining the proper posture that protected his healing spine. They walked toward the house together, Ethan animatedly describing something while Daniel listened attentively. The scene looked so normal, so healthy, father and son sharing conversation at the end of a day together. If I didn't know the complicated history behind this simple moment, I might have found it unremarkable. I opened the door before they reached it, greeting them with a smile that came more naturally than I might have expected. "How was your day?" I asked Ethan, accepting his careful hug. "Awesome! We went to the Science Museum after lunch, and they have a new dinosaur exhibit." Ethan's excitement bubbled over as he described the fossils and interactive displays they had explored. "That sounds wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased by his enthusiasm. "Why don't you go get started on the homework Ms. Peterson sent home? I'll be there to help in a minute." As Ethan disappeared into his room, I turned to Daniel, who remained on the porch, respecting the boundary of my new home by not entering without explicit invitation. "The Science Museum was a nice surprise," I commented. "The exhibit just opened this weekend," he explained. "When his physical therapist mentioned how well he's doing with longer outings, I thought he might enjoy it." He hesitated, then added, "I should have checked with you first about extending our time. I'm sorry about that." The apology was unexpected but appreciated. "It's fine," I assured him. "He clearly had a great time. Just let me know in advance next time so I don't worry." Daniel nodded, accepting the gentle correction without defensiveness. "Absolutely, I will." He reached into his pocket and handed me a small paper bag. "The physical therapist gave me this topical cream for Ethan's scar tissue. It should help with the itching he's been experiencing." I accepted the bag, noting the prescription label and written instructions. "Thank you. I'll apply it before bedtime." An awkward moment followed. The familiar end-of-exchange pause that often occurred during these handoffs. In our old life, Daniel might have entered the house, spent the evening with us, belonged within these walls. Now he stood outside, a visitor rather than a resident, permitted into Ethan's life but not mine. "Well, I should get going," he said finally. "Let Ethan know I'll see him Thursday for therapy." I nodded, about to close the door when a question occurred to me, one I'd been hesitant to ask but suddenly felt important. "Daniel, have you heard from Vanessa since she moved to Chicago?" Surprise flickered across his face at the unexpected inquiry. "No," he said after a moment. "She made it very clear that chapter was closed. Why do you ask?" I shrugged, unsure myself why I'd raised the subject. "Just curious. I found the ring while unpacking today. I'm planning to sell it for Ethan's medical fund." Daniel winced slightly at the mention of the ring, tangible evidence of his planned betrayal. "That's a good use for it," he said quietly. "Better than its intended purpose." The honesty of this acknowledgement, the implicit admission that his plans with Vanessa had been a mistake, caught me off guard. "Yes, well, Ethan's needs come first now." "As they always should have," Daniel agreed, his gaze direct and clear. "I'm trying to remember that every day." After he left, I joined Ethan in his room, where he was already focused on his math worksheet. "Dad helped me with the first 2 problems," he reported. "He showed me a cool trick for multiplying by 9. "That's great," I said, sitting beside him on the bed. "How are you feeling? Not too tired from your museum adventure?" Ethan shook, his expression serious. "I was careful with my posture the whole time, like the physical therapist showed me. And when I got tired, Dad found me a bench to rest on right away." These small details of attentive care, Daniel noticing Ethan's fatigue, responding appropriately, prioritizing his physical well-being, represented the parenting I had always hoped he would provide. It was bittersweet to witness this growth. Now, after our marriage had ended, but I couldn't deny its positive impact on Ethan. "Dad says when my back is stronger, maybe this summer we can go camping," Ethan continued excitedly. "Not in a tent because that wouldn't be good for my spine, but in one of those cabin things at the state park. He already checked with Dr. Cohen and she said it might be possible if I keep up with my exercises." The advanced planning, the consultation. With the doctor, the consideration of Ethan's medical needs, all represented a fundamental shift in Daniel's approach to fatherhood. He wasn't just showing up. He was thinking ahead, anticipating needs, creating appropriate adventures for Ethan's condition. "That sounds like something to look forward to," I said, helping Ethan with his next math problem. "If Dr. Cohen approves it, a cabin camping trip would be wonderful." Later that evening, after Ethan was asleep, I sat on my new back porch with a glass of wine, enjoying the quiet of the neighborhood and the faint scent of jasmine from a nearby garden. 8 weeks ago, I had been a betrayed wife sitting in a hospital waiting room, selling my husband's car and changing our locks in a desperate bid for justice and self-respect. Now, I was a homeowner, about to start a new job, navigating the complexities of co-parenting with a man who was simultaneously familiar and unrecognizable. The changes hadn't all been external. Something fundamental had shifted within me as, well, a reclaiming of personal power, a refusal to accept less than I deserved, a willingness to rebuild rather than merely repair. Selling Daniel's car had been just the beginning, the first decisive step toward this new life. It wasn't about punishment or revenge, though those elements had certainly existed in that heated moment. It was about asserting boundaries, establishing consequences, demanding the respect I had too long relinquished in the name of keeping peace. My phone chimed with a text from Rachel. "First night alone in the new house. How are you holding up?" The question made me smile. Rachel still viewed my situation through the lens of trauma and loss, unable to fully understand the liberation I felt in this fresh beginning. "Actually doing great," I replied honestly. "It feels right being here, like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." As I set the phone down, I realized the truth of those words. Despite the painful journey that had led here, despite the ongoing challenges of Ethan's recovery and the practicalities of divorce, I had landed exactly where I needed to be. In choosing to sell that car, change those locks, and walk away from a marriage that no longer served me, I hadn't just reacted to betrayal, I had reclaimed my future. The wine in my glass caught the porch light, glinting like possibilities. Ahead lay my new job, Ethan's continued recovery, the finalization of the divorce, and countless decisions yet to be made. But for the first time in longer than I could, remember, I faced those uncertainties with confidence rather than anxiety, with anticipation rather than dread. This house, this moment, this version of myself, all were hard-won, emerging from choices made in moments of both crisis and clarity. The woman who had once accommodated betrayal to maintain peace had been replaced by one who recognized her own worth and demanded it be acknowledged, not through dramatic gestures or ongoing retribution, but through the quiet, consistent assertion of boundaries and expectations. I finished my wine and stood, looking up at the stars barely visible, through Portland's perpetual cloud cover. Whatever came next, I would face it on my terms, in my house, with keys that had never been in anyone else's hands. That certainty, more than anything else, felt like victory. 6 months had passed since we'd moved into the new house. Winter had given way to spring, and Portland's perpetual drizzle had transformed into occasional sunshine that coaxed flowers from every garden on our street. Ethan's recovery had progressed remarkably well, his surgical scars fading to thin silver lines, his mobility returning to near normal levels. The titanium rods in his spine would remain permanently, but he had adjusted to his new normal with the resilience only children seem to possess. My third-grade classroom at Westside Elementary had become a second home, a place where I rediscovered my passion for teaching that had been overshadowed during the latter years of my marriage. My students' energy and curiosity provided daily reminders of why I'd chosen education as my career, while the short walk between school and our house allowed me to remain accessible for Ethan's needs. Today marked another milestone, the final divorce hearing. After months of paperwork, negotiations, and waiting periods, Daniel and I would stand before a judge and formally end our 10-year marriage. The proceedings were expected to be straightforward. We had agreed on all terms, from asset division to custody arrangements, but the symbolic weight of the moment couldn't be denied. "Are you nervous?" Rachel asked, helping me choose an appropriate outfit for court. She had arrived early, bearing coffee and moral support in equal measure. "Not nervous exactly," I replied, selecting a simple navy dress that projected calm competence rather than emotional fragility. More reflective. It's strange to think that a decade of marriage will end in a 15-minute hearing. Rachel nodded, understanding the complexity behind my measured response. Have you told Ethan what today means? We've talked about it gradually over the past few months, I explained, pinning my hair into a neat twist. He knows that after today, the divorce will be official, though I'm not sure that distinction means much to him. The practical reality of living in two homes has been his normal for a while now. Our custody arrangement had settled into a predictable rhythm: weekdays with me, alternating weekends with Daniel, and shared responsibility for medical appointments and school events. To my ongoing surprise, Daniel had maintained his post-surgery transformation into a reliable, engaged father. The man who had once missed his son's operation for his mistress now built his entire schedule around Ethan's needs, never missing a physical therapy session or school conference. "And how does Daniel seem about today?" Rachel inquired, her tone suggesting she still harbored doubts about his character, despite his consistent improvement. I considered the question as I applied minimal makeup. Practical, respectful. He suggested we have lunch after the hearing to discuss summer vacation plans for Ethan. Lunch? Just the two of you? Rachel's eyebrows shot up in surprise. It's not what you're thinking, I assured her with a small smile. We're discussing Ethan's schedule, not reconciling. Being able to have a civil meal together makes co-parenting easier. Before Rachel could respond, the doorbell rang. Margaret arriving to stay with Ethan while we attended court. Though it was a school day, we'd arranged for him to stay home, partly to shield him from the emotional weight of the proceedings, and partly because Daniel's mother had requested this time with her grandson. "You look lovely, dear," Margaret greeted me warmly, her silver hair elegantly styled as always. Very composed. "Thank you for staying with Ethan," I said, genuinely grateful for her continued presence in our lives. Despite the divorce, Margaret had maintained her relationship with me independently of her bond with Daniel, never taking sides or making excuses for her son's behavior. "Of course," she replied, setting down her bag containing activities she'd planned for Ethan. "He and I are going to work on his dinosaur diorama for the science fair. I brought some special materials from the crafts store." Ethan emerged from his room at the sound of his grandmother's voice, moving with the easy grace that had gradually returned as his spine healed. "Grandma, did you bring the special clay you promised?" "I brought everything we discussed," Margaret confirmed, embracing him carefully. "We'll have it looking museum quality by the time your mom gets home." I knelt to give Ethan a hug goodbye. "Be good for Grandma, okay? I'll be back this afternoon." "I know," he said with the casual confidence of a child who had adjusted to new routines. "You and Dad are going to court to make the divorce official, and then you're having lunch to talk about summer vacation." His matter-of-fact summary of the day's significance took me by surprise, though it shouldn't have. Ethan had always been perceptive, processing complex adult situations through his own understanding. "That's right," I confirmed. "Nothing is changing from how things have been. This is just paperwork." As Rachel and I drove downtown toward the courthouse, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had led to this moment. The shock of Daniel's betrayal, the fury of discovering his absence during Ethan's surgery, the decisive actions I'd taken in selling his car and changing our locks, all seemed simultaneously recent and distant, vivid, yet somehow belonging to another lifetime. "Penny for your thoughts?" Rachel asked, navigating through morning traffic. "I was just thinking about how much has changed in 6 months," I replied. "When I sold Daniel's car, I was acting purely on instinct, hurt, angry, determined not to be disrespected again. I had no idea that one impulsive decision would set everything else in motion." Rachel smiled. "Not so impulsive. You'd been gathering evidence for months. You knew exactly what you were doing. Maybe, I conceded. But I couldn't have predicted where it would lead. My own house, a new job, a healthier relationship with Daniel as co-parents than we ever had as spouses. We arrived at the courthouse 20 minutes early, finding Daniel already waiting outside the assigned courtroom. He wore a conservative suit, not the designer label he would have insisted on during our marriage, but something more modest and appropriate. Like me, he had prepared for this moment with dignity rather than drama. "Good morning," he greeted us politely. "Everything ready?" I nodded. "James is meeting us inside. All the paperwork is in order." Rachel excused herself to find the restroom, giving us a moment of privacy before the proceedings. Daniel shifted slightly, his expression contemplative. "Strange day," he observed quietly. "Not how I imagined our story would end when we got married." "No," I agreed, "but better than where we were headed 6 months ago." He nodded, acknowledging the truth in my statement. "I spoke with Ethan this morning before school. Wanted to check in, make sure he understood today doesn't change anything practical." "I did the same," I said, appreciating his attention to our son's emotional well-being. "He seems to be processing it healthily." Daniel smiled slightly. "He told me he's working on a dinosaur diorama with my mother today. Apparently it's going to be epic." The shared moment of parental amusement felt natural, comfortable in a way that surprised me. We had found our way to this new relationship. Not friends exactly, but friendly co-parents, united in our love for Ethan if nothing else. The hearing itself was indeed brief and anticlimactic. The judge reviewed our settlement agreement, confirmed we both understood and accepted its terms, and pronounced our marriage dissolved in less than 20 minutes. No dramatic revelations, no last-minute objections, just the quiet conclusion of a chapter that had already effectively ended months earlier. As we left the courtroom, James Montgomery, my attorney, shook both our hands. "One of the smoothest divorces I've handled," he commented. "Congratulations on keeping it civil." Daniel's lawyer made similar remarks before departing, leaving us standing in the courthouse corridor, officially unmarried for the first time in a decade. "Still up for lunch?" Daniel asked after Rachel had hugged me goodbye and departed for her office. "Yes," I confirmed. "We should discuss Ethan's summer schedule." We walked to a nearby cafe, neutral territory, as Daniel had once described it, and found a quiet table by the window. After ordering, Daniel pulled out his phone and opened his calendar app. "I've been thinking about Ethan's summer activities," he began. "The physical therapist suggested swimming would be excellent for his continued recovery. There's a good program at the community center near my apartment." We spent the next hour productively discussing Ethan's summer, which weeks he would stay with each of us, which camps and activities might accommodate his physical needs while keeping him engaged and social. Daniel had researched options thoroughly, considering both Ethan's interests and his medical requirements. It was the kind of parental initiative he had rarely shown during our marriage. As we finished our meals, Daniel hesitated, then said, "There's something else I wanted to discuss, if that's all right." I nodded cautiously, unsure what to expect. "I've accepted a new position," he continued, "still with Westridge Financial, but heading their new sustainable investment division. It means more regular hours, less travel." "That sounds positive," I observed, genuinely pleased he was making career choices that accommodated his parental responsibilities. "Ethan will appreciate the consistency." "That's the main reason I accepted it," Daniel confirmed. "But there's another aspect I wanted to run by you. The office is relocating to the Cedar Mill area." I immediately understood the significance. Cedar Mill was much closer to our new house than his current downtown location. "That would make logistics easier for pickups and drop-offs," I acknowledged. "Exactly. And I've been thinking about moving closer as well, when my apartment lease ends. Not to intrude on your space," he added quickly, "but to be more accessible for Ethan's needs, especially as he gets more involved in school activities. The suggestion was reasonable, considerate even. 6 months ago, I might have viewed it as an attempt to insert himself back into our lives, but now I recognized it for what it was: a father prioritizing his child's well-being. I think that makes sense, I agreed. Ethan would benefit from having you nearby, especially as his activities increase. Daniel seemed relieved by my response. Thank you. I'll start looking at options in the area, not too close but convenient for shared custody. As we finished lunch and prepared to part ways, Daniel paused. Melissa, I know today is supposed to represent an ending, but in some ways, it feels more like a beginning. A healthier beginning for how we'll move forward as Ethan's parents. The observation resonated with my own feelings about the day. I agree. We're better at this, being Ethan's parents, than we were at being married to each other. That's because we're both finally showing up authentically, Daniel suggested. No more pretending or avoiding or hiding. His insight surprised me with its accuracy. The crisis of his betrayal and Ethan's surgery had stripped away our mutual pretenses, forcing us both to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our relationship. From that painful honesty had emerged something unexpected: a functional, respectful co-parenting partnership. We walked to our separate cars, the weight of the morning's legal proceedings giving way to the practical reality of our new normal. I'll pick Ethan up Friday after school as usual, Daniel confirmed before we parted. He'll be ready, I assured him, and excited about the Science Museum this weekend. On the drive home, I found myself smiling. Not because the divorce brought joy, it represented loss, however necessary, but because I recognized how far I'd come since that devastating day in the hospital when I'd learned my husband had chosen his mistress over his son's surgery. The woman who had sold Daniel's car and changed the locks had been acting from raw pain and righteous anger, finding her power in a moment of crisis. The woman driving home from her divorce hearing was operating from quiet strength and clear boundaries, comfortable in the life she had rebuilt from the wreckage of betrayal. As I pulled into the driveway of my house, with my locks, my choices, I heard Ethan's laughter floating through the open window. Inside, I found him, and Margaret surrounded by craft supplies, working on what did indeed look like a museum-quality dinosaur diorama. Mom! Ethan greeted me enthusiastically. Look what Grandma and I made. It's a Jurassic habitat with accurate vegetation and everything. I admired their creation, genuinely impressed by the detail and care they had invested. It's amazing. Honey, definitely science fair worthy. Is the divorce all finished? He asked, his tone matter-of-fact as he adjusted a tiny prehistoric tree. Yes, I confirmed simply. Everything went exactly as planned. Ethan nodded, seemingly satisfied with this straightforward answer. Dad texted me a picture of a new swimming program he found for summer. He said we'd talk about it this weekend. That sounds perfect, I said, exchanging a warm glance with Margaret, who had witnessed both Daniel's worst behavior and his eventual growth into responsible fatherhood. Later, after Margaret had gone and Ethan was engrossed in homework, I stepped onto the back porch with a cup of tea. The garden we had planted together was beginning to flourish, green shoots promising summer flowers and vegetables. Like everything else in our new life, it represented fresh growth emerging from properly prepared ground. 6 months ago, I had changed the locks on my house and sold my husband's car in a moment of justified anger. Today, I had finalized my divorce with surprising civility and planned a summer of cooperative co-parenting. The journey between those points hadn't been easy, but it had led exactly where I needed to go. Not back to what was comfortable and familiar, but forward into what was healthy and true. As I sipped my tea and watched a hummingbird visit our newly planted salvia, I felt something that had been elusive for years: contentment. Not because everything was perfect, life never is, but because I had created a home and a future that aligned with my authentic self. In selling Daniel's car, I hadn't just acted on impulse or sought revenge. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my power, establishing consequences, and building a life that honored my worth rather than diminished it. The hummingbird darted away, catching the late afternoon sunlight on its iridescent wings. Like that tiny bird, I had found a new freedom, one built not on the absence of challenges but on the presence of strength to meet them. Whatever came next, for me, for Ethan, for our reconfigurated family, we would face it from this foundation of truth and well-earned wisdom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.